Check, check, 1, 2. 1, 2, 3. Cindy, just seeing if you can hear what I'm saying, and I kind of want to see what the delay is. So I just switched to computer, which is blank right now. Switching back to camera. See what the delay is in these captions popping up on the screen. Awesome, awesome. Thank you very much. Looks good. Looks like just a couple second delay. If you're good, just be on standby. I think everything's going to get going right at 1:45, maybe a minute or two before. We'll open up the mics when it gets close, and you'll just hear some crowd noise, and then it should sound pretty clear and clean to you when they get up on the mics. Thank you again.
try my best. Oh, that'd be my rehearsals and nailing it at a time is right out the window. But I'll be good. I'll quit at 15. I'll be good. I'll quit at 15. So that happened to me that I was on a panel at Arsen, and the guy wouldn't show up. And so I had to keep it. So my 20 minutes went to 15, and I wasn't ready for it. It was terrible. Because I was fine up until the last 2 minutes, and I'm like, okay, I've got 7 more stuff. I couldn't think fast enough to summarize it. Psychologists does it take to screw in a light bulb? Just one, but light bulb is really fun.
Okay, if we could have everyone take their seats, please. Welcome back. I hope everyone had a chance either to eat here or at our dining facility and at least see a little bit of the campus while it's not a deluge of rain coming down. It will this afternoon and this evening. So welcome you back for our next panel, and I'd like to introduce our panel moderator, Molly Dunnigan. Molly's a senior political scientist and associate director of the Defense and Political Sciences Department at the RAND Corporation. She's also a lecturer at Carnegie Mellon University's Institute of Politics and Strategy. Her research interests focus on private military and security contractors, civil-military relations, irregular warfare, counterinsurgency, maritime security, and civilian deployment. She is a recipient of numerous awards, including a U.S. Institute of Peace Jennings Randolph Peace Fellowship, a U.S. State Department Foreign Language Areas Study Fellowship, and an International Studies Association Catalytic Research Grant. Molly's widely published. Prominent among her works are Victory for Hire, Private Security Companies' Impact on Military Effectiveness, The Markets for Force, Privatization of Security Across the World Regions, and several RAND reports. And we have 2 of Molly's books in back for sale when we have a break. An internationally recognized expert on private security contracting, Molly's work on this topic has been cited in USA Today, Time Magazine, The Washington Post, U.S. News and World Report, and Forbes. Molly's topic tomorrow you'll find of great interest, and she gave us a preview today, but we'd also like to say thank you to Molly up front. When we first came up with this topic, we reached out to Molly through another friend at the RAND Corporation, and Molly provided us not only a verification that this was a topic of great interest, but also helped us reach out to several of you who are here today. So up front, I'd like to say thank you to Molly for bringing us all together. So at this time, Molly.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. That was a really nice introduction, and I actually am not going to talk very much on this panel, so I appreciate the introduction. So this is going to be a really interesting panel on governance laws and ethical standards, and we have 4 accomplished researchers and practitioners up here. We're going to go in this order across the table. So first, I would like to introduce Dr. C. Anthony or Tony Pfaff. Dr. Pfaff is the research professor for the military profession and ethic at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. A retired Army colonel, Dr. Pfaff recently served as director for Iraq on the National Security Council staff. While on active duty in the Army, he served on the policy planning staff at the State Department as the defense attaché in Baghdad, the chief of international military affairs for U.S. Army Central Command, and as the defense attaché in Kuwait. He served twice in Operation Iraqi Freedom, once as the Deputy J2 for Joint Special Operations Task Force, and as the Senior Military Advisor for the Civilian Police Assistance Training Team. Dr. Pfaff has a bachelor's degree in philosophy and economics from Washington and Lee University, a master's degree in philosophy from Stanford University, a master's degree in national resource management from the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, and a doctorate in philosophy from Georgetown University. With that, I'll turn it over to you.
Happy to be here. So, ethics. What I thought I'd talk about today, kind of zero in on Erik Prince's offer to privatize the war in Afghanistan. One reason that's it's a great thing to talk about and a great problem to solve is that if we can figure out how to make that would work, probably everything else is going to, anything else might fall into place. But in 15 minutes, as you've seen from the other presentations, you got to move fast. So I'm probably going to cover more how I might go about solving, addressing the issue than actually giving you any answers, because as a background in philosophy, that's just not what we do anyway. But I will suggest some things to do in the end. So anyway, the proposal. As you can see from there, I'm not going to read it all out to you, but it does represent if it works, it represents a significantly increased efficiency at a lower cost, while also incorporating some concerns about accountability. But what maybe differentiates it from other kinds of contracts that the government signs with security providers and private military companies is that rather than just simply augmenting U.S. forces, they would act in lieu of. Specifically, the point is that they would replace a lot of the conventional component in what's out there already in Afghanistan. This was proposed in August of 17. Didn't get a lot of takers. Specifically, Secretary Mattis and General Kelly didn't like the idea very much. Were very vocal about that. But what I would say is, as we already learned today in earlier presentations, it's not without precedent and it's not without merit. We already talked a little bit about executive outcomes and some of the things they were able to accomplish. Nigeria and Sierra Leone, and there's other success stories that means you probably should take the proposal a bit more seriously. But to do that, we got to get through the objections, which there are several. These objections arise from the tension that comes from when a private company wants to provide a public good, in this case, the public good of security. The thing about public goods is that they are non-excludable and non-rival, which means no one should be excluded from their benefit, and the benefits should not be reduced by adding additional customers. Moreover, the provision of public goods is normative. Governments are supposed to provide these goods. That's what makes them a public good. And when they fail, we question not just their effectiveness as a state, but their legitimacy. So that point makes the private provision of public goods, or the provision of public goods, resistant to the good practices associated with profit making. Now, when we consider these objections, I break them up into two different kinds. One is contingent, and what makes an objection contingent is that, well, it can apply to other things, not just a private military company. We worry about accountability. We worry about financial motives being a reason to engage in violent force. We worry about lack of transparency in our public, what I'll call public militaries as well. Now, perhaps what's more concerning, but still I would argue contingent, with private military companies being employed in lieu of conventional forces or in lieu of military forces, is that they can lower the threshold, they can lower the costs and risks, particularly the political risks associated with using force, and thus lower the threshold for decisions to go to war. But the other thing about contingent problem is that we can, and I'm going to come back to them later in more detail, but they can largely be, they in principle at least, can be subject to regulation and oversight. The harder problems are the ones that James Pattison calls deeply problematic. And the thing about these deeply problematic problems is, I got to get better at that. Deeply problematic concerns is that they're more embedded in the structure of the relationship. You can't just regulate them away. So you've got to figure out another way to address them if you want to be successful, or if you want to be able to account for all the norms associated with this process. So, I'm going to start looking at the deeply problematic one, and here I'm really focusing on legitimacy. When a private company provides a public good, it suggests two conditions for legitimacy that we'll start with. One is that the provision, the services provided by the PMC will be subject to the public norms. And we already talked about, these contingent problems that give rise to what I'll call moral hazards. There needs to be measures in place to take care of them. There's a couple of paths to this. One, which is one that I think that's largely employed, which is the identification of what's inherently governmental and what's not. So in this kind of model, the state provides the public good. The private military company provides some kind of support to that, but it's state actors doing that that are actually providing the force. So while I can't imagine the U.S. Army going to war without lobster night on Thursdays, but that doesn't count as the same kind of thing as what what Erik Prince is talking about when they're acting in lieu of using military forces. The problem with this model is that PMCs operate precisely where governments don't, or can't, or won't. So whether it's because of will, as in the case of Darfur, where a number of PMCs have offered the ability to go in and conduct peacekeeping operations there, or as we talked about, or capability, as we talked about earlier in Nigeria, PMCs find a role where governments should act but do not. So this model is not going to work. Then you have James Pattinson, who's written a lot about this, and I'm kind of relying on some of his work, but he had the idea that, well, one way to look at it is, well, what has to be true to make any kind of force-providing organization legitimate? And so he has this idea of cumulative legitimacy, where there's four conditions. One is that you have to be effective, and effective within accordance with the rules. Have to be subject to democratic control. You have to treat your people fairly. And engaging in that organization, in that practice, builds communal bonds. And the idea here is that you join the military, you serve, you develop an affinity for your community. The fact other people may have served in that, builds bonds. And he says these four conditions, which don't all have to be met the same way, but cumulatively they establish the legitimacy of that particular organization. And his point is, well, public militaries will always win over private military companies in this model. Because they're already kind of set up to do that. And so since they're always preferable, he'll concede that there's some conditions where you might hire a PMC, but the offer that we're considering here wouldn't be one of them. Ones he thinks about are more ones like where it would be humanitarian and peacekeeping operations. The problem is, I agree that with Pattinson that legitimacy is the concern. I think this provides useful insights on what would make a public military legitimate. It seems intended to fail when applied to PMCs. And the reason is simple. Given his four conditions, public militaries have a presumption of legitimacy that PMCs would have to compete for with far fewer resources. So it seems kind of self-defeating. So rather than looking at the legitimacy of PMCs through a lens of which they are not, I think let's look at through a lens of what they are, which is a proxy, particularly in the way that Prince has constructed this model. Here, and so going back to our conditions, let's look at how that would work for the proxy to fulfill the obligations of the public norms that would normally govern that activity. I'm going to start with just war theory, Why? Because it's a fairly robust framework, normative framework for these kinds of concerns. If you can meet these, you can probably meet any other kind of framework you're going to come up with. Now, not all of these actually apply, and they don't always apply directly. The employment of a private military company will not make unjust cause just, an illegitimate authority legitimate, or wrong intention right. However, they can potentially make the disproportionate proportionate, make alternatives to fighting less appealing, which would impact what counts as last resort, and certainly affect the state's calculations regarding its costs and chances for success. So we have to account for those concerns before we move forward. So the first one is look at just cause, and how do you align the private company's interest with the state's, assuming a just cause. So I'm going to make a long story short because I don't have a lot of time. The first thing it suggests is that there's a greater burden on the contractor and the individual members of the contracting company to assess the justice of the cause of war before signing in. They have an ability to opt in that your conventional, your soldiers in a public military don't. So they have to consider that before signing on to a contract. The contract should be written in a way that the realization of the state interests should realize the interests of the PMC, or at least lead to the termination of the contract. Moreover, you need to write, the contract needs to be written in a way that accounts for the public goods being provided. It can't just account for the service. So in this case, it can't just simply say, I'm providing X number of advisors to this particular unit. It has to be tied some way to a provision of the public good. In this case, typically you see, in this context, peace, stability, and order. When it comes to reasonable chances of success, proportionality and last resort, which are roughly under the costs of war, these require judgments that are very difficult to consider in to anticipate, which can make it hard to assess. And I think Dr. Dunnigan did a good job talking about all the problems associated with that and how to assess effectiveness, which is not something I'm going to be able to go into a lot of detail here. But you have to, what doesn't count in this is the fact that the PMC should, it might reduce your political cost. Rather, it has to be, the PMC should not only be able to get the job done, but also in accordance with the same rules that apply to the military, which is proportionately and only if there are other no violent means available. Yep, I got it. Another one that we talked about earlier is secrecy, is secrecy. And so one of the conditions of just war is public declaration. And we talked about how often PMCs are hired in order to distance a government from a particular operation. And the U.S. law actually facilitates this because any contract $50 million or lower can allow for work abroad for the United States government, can avoid congressional oversight. That's allowed the government to get around or to conduct operations in places like Colombia without that. And all I'll say here is the fun part here is trying to figure out what the exceptions might be. And there is a case where MPRI in Bosnia was employed to build up the Bosnian army, which was essential to getting the peace accords signed. But had the U.S. military done that, it would have been very hard for the U.S. to broker, to broker the peace. So that suggests there might be some conditions, particularly when that non-public disclosure advantages not just yourself, not just your partners, but every party to the conflict. You might have some conditions where there is permission to have, at least for non-public disclosure. When it comes to legitimate authority, we already kind of, again, we talked about PMC is not going to affect the legitimacy of the it's not going to affect the legitimacy of the cause, and it's also should not replace the state as the authorizer for force. However, it doesn't mean a state can't delegate the provision of force while retaining that authority. And the point here really is that it's still bounded by the they're still bounded by the normal rules associated with war. And I even make the point, because I thought the Americana example earlier today was very instructive, because it's not just maybe about abiding by the laws of war, because what counts as legitimate violence depends a lot on your context. If there's already an order in place, it might be more appropriate to employ the kind of standards that are associated with law enforcement. And any PMC taking on a contract is not to be sensitive to that. So the last part I was going to talk about was the moral hazards. And in the 1 minute I have, I'm going to list them here. We can talk about them more in question and answers. But it's that public-private tension. It never goes away. It can give rise to diverging interest as companies seek to expand the scope of the contract, perhaps seemingly in benign ways, but in ways that, in ways that eventually undermine the interest of the original contracting party, in this case, the state. There's certainly an incentive to underestimate costs and risks. That has to be accounted for, suggesting that states, when they should incorporate a total cost assessment of what happens if the company is not successful. What would that total cost be to them? And in Dirty Hands, diffusion, you had a case where Croat soldiers trained by MPRI ended up working for the Kosovars and later running into conflicts with the United States at a later point. And finally, Dirty Hands, which again has to be subject to oversight and well, what I'm going to say, a dirty hands judgment is when a public official decides he has to do something that seems to be necessary but is immoral. PMCs should never be in that position. PMCs, if that PMC finds itself in that position, then it should kick that back up. And so, a little over time. You're not intended to actually read this slide, but based on all the considerations that I just covered, here is a set of norms that I think, if we're able to address them in the context of the contract, you might find space for Prince's offer to be permissible. That triple note. We're done.
All right, thank you so much, Tony. Okay, next we have Ms. Caroline Batka. Caroline is a doctoral candidate at the Department of Political Science at Comenius University in Bratislava, Slovakia. Batka's dissertation research focuses on the institutional components of the Department of Defense that hinder and facilitate integration of operational contractors into strategy. From October 2011 to July 2016, Caroline worked at the RAND Corporation in Washington, D.C., where she did research focusing on Army operations and planning, military programs, and policy, healthcare, and veterans issues. Caroline has also worked at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, the Disabled American Veterans, and the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Caroline has a Master of Public Administration from the University of Washington in Seattle and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Communication from Virginia Tech. I'll turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Really thankful to be here, and I also feel like we have just a short amount of time, but this afternoon panel benefits from having the earlier panels because I'm going to be able to breeze through some of the topics that we went through before. So like Molly said, I'm going to be talking about considerations for DoD leaders as they seek to integrate operational contractors into the agency's strategy. And just a quick note, I'm going to be using this term operational contractors. I'm talking about all the contractors that provide the range of services from base support to logistics and technical services and security and military services as well. So the earlier presentations talked about some of these integration issues. You know, as Mr. Raff was talking about earlier and as Molly discussed, DoD has taken a lot of efforts to integrate contractors into strategy. So some of these efforts like the operational contract support, the joint acquisition support office have been of value. But the road to integrating contractors into strategy is a lot longer than these sort of one-off efforts. Mr. Raff talked also about this value of integrating contractors. Eating dinner together, the HUMINT, it is hugely important for how contractors are going to be able to work and contribute to DoD's mission. So that's what we're going to be talking about as it relates to this idea of ethics, law, and governance. This is my PhD research that I'm going to be talking about. a lit review on esprit de corps, a survey that I conducted with Molly and another colleague from Rand Corporation, Rachel Burns, and then lastly, my dissertation research, which is a qualitative case study on integrating contractors into DoD strategy. So I'll start off with this discussion of a lit review. So this research I conducted with Chris Kinsey from King's College London, and we're trying to look at how the outsourcing of expeditionary support functions, so not looking at military or security contractors, but just those contractors who are providing logistical and technical and a range of base support services, how that outsourcing could impact combat units themselves and their esprit de corps. And we did a literature review, which was quite robust, looking at what was out there in Google Scholar, what GAO and RAND had written, and then looking at the cited literature from those searches. So I'll talk about 3 findings: the definition of esprit de corps, the chain of command, and contractors as social reference groups. So esprit de corps is sort of this nebulous topic. It's a notion that you can sort of feel, and it's hard to define. Certainly being here at UNG, you can feel a strong esprit de corps for the university and the cadets here. But in reviewing a substantial amount of literature, it's hard to sort of nail it down to what we're talking about. Esprit de corps is a we group. This is a community that is driven by the same feelings of pride and commitment to achieving a mission. But this nebulous sort of nature of esprit de corps has been problematic in its misinterpretation. And we've seen in our research that issues with the Abu Ghraib prison torture incident and also issues with corruption in the Indonesian military were chalked up to a lot of service members and contractors believing that this type of misconduct was associated with esprit de corps. And it's also been associated with other negative behaviors in the military, like sexual assault and sexual harassment and hazing. And these are obviously not the types of behavior that the US military wants to espouse. But the problem is that even though esprit de corps has been written into DoD instruction and in laws and regulations, it's not clear when you try to match sort of this idea of esprit de corps being associated with a marching band or a color guard, how that sort of plays out when you're trying to conduct war. The second issue that we found in our literature review was that contractors are obviously outside of the chain of command, and that can cause problems for trying to maintain esprit de corps for commanders. And that integrating contractors is inherently different from the integration of other service members that research has looked at in the past. So thinking about integration of women or non-white service members or individuals from the LGBT community is inherently different because contractors are outside of the chain of command. The last point from this literature that I want to touch on is that contractors serve as social reference groups for service members and also for DoD personnel. So this basically means that contractors are serving as social touch points of comparison, and service members are specifically looking at contractors' pay and their risks and their duties and their housing, and they're making big comparisons for this and how it relates to themselves. And I wanted to set this up because it's related to my second topic, which is a survey that I conducted, like I said, with Molly and another colleague from RAND, looking at the financial experiences of operational contractors. So we wanted to look at the range of operational contractors' gross annual income, their sources of gross annual income, and their most salient pecuniary and motivational factors that drive them to work in this industry. So why look at financial experiences? You know, I talked about this social reference group issue. There's a lot of talk about contractors. I've already heard the word mercenary used. I think it's not clear really what their financial experiences are. And it's been debated on both sides that contractors are better set up than service members. And on the other side, I think folks have been interested in looking at this comparison. So we wanted to add some data to this discussion. This is a convenient sample survey. We used SurveyMonkey to target English-speaking operational contractors who had deployed on contracts since January 1st, 2003. We used emails, LinkedIn, and Facebook group to get a total of 187 consented respondents. And sort of the headline from the study was that we did find contractors make a lot of money, right? So 86% of our respondents made over $100,000 a year in gross annual income. But what does that mean? So yes, $100,000 in gross annual income is a lot, and it's more than the median income in 2016 was $59,000. So yes, it's a lot more than that. But if you look at the DoD civilian comparisons or at service members, it's not a clear comparison in terms of who we're comparing in terms of which contractors and which DoD civilians. It's been, in a few areas of research, it's been noted that U.S. agencies prefer to deploy civilians at the upper end of the GS scale. So if we're looking at a GS 13s, 14s, and 15s, it's sort of in the mix there as 100,000 as a not out of reach baseline. If we're comparing an E6 to a contractor, yeah, they're making a lot less than some of these contractors. But if we're talking about a colonel, it's also right sort of in the baseline. And there are a few confounding factors to note. Danger pay, government benefits like healthcare, life insurance, and retirement benefits are not included in this contractor pay that has been sort of discussed as so relatively high. And also tax exemption is another factor that needs to be considered in this discussion. And just quickly to note that we also found that contractors are motivated by a range of different factors. So the number one, we were asking about the number one factor for wanting to work in this industry. And the highest factor was pay at 44%. But 34% said that they were motivated by the mission of the work. So this is a range, this is a group of folks who are wanting to work in the field for a lot of different reasons. They're motivated by money, but it's not money alone. And lastly, I'll talk about my dissertation research. And I'm looking at the institutional components of DoD that hinder and facilitate integration of operational contractors into strategy. So just a quick note about DoD as an institution. I'm talking about the U.S. military as more than just an organization. DoD is an institution with a long-term structure, with history and culture, subcultures, language, and symbols that are all critical for how the U.S. military and the world functions. So I'm aiming to look at these more deeper and resilient aspects of the institution, from saluting to uniforms that impact the way that the organization functions. I have 6 main data collection techniques that I'm doing to conduct this case study. A lit review, I'm looking at congressional materials, policy guidance and law. I'm doing qualitative interviews and direct observation, and I'm looking at news articles as well. So I just want to quickly touch on some of the preliminary findings from my research in terms of the facilitators and inhibitors. Molly talked about this earlier in the presentation. This JOPEC, the Joint Operational Contract Support and Planning and Execution course, has been identified as a major facilitator of integrating contractors into strategy. It's a 9-day course. It's for more senior officers and senior DoD personnel and contractors, but it really does make a huge difference in operationalizing some of the complex laws and guidance that serve on this area. The 2 bottom facilitators that I've noted here, I think, are intuitive, well-written contracts, well-trained and experienced contracting officers and contracting officer representatives integrate contractors into strategies better. And lastly, the experience and relationships between DoD personnel and service members and the contractors themselves are huge. A lot of the captains and majors that were serving in Iraq and Afghanistan are now generals, and so they've sort of lived this experience. And if it's a good experience, it's facilitating integration. So in terms of the inhibitors, just to note some that are the most salient, programs and services focus on money and people, sort of as a barrier to them integrating contractors into their work. The DoD-wide lack of contracting knowledge is a big obstacle, and the complex laws and guidance that are out there for DoD are extremely difficult and a challenge for the DoD. So because this panel is focused on law, I'll just say a minute about it. That DoD, is contracting in the international community, in the federal government. So it's dealing with sort of this buildup in reaction to some of the issues that have happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, and what's resulted from all of the different laws and policies and sort of on the ground work in contracting is that it's like a patchwork quilt of not knowing which policies and laws and guidance to follow, because in some cases these guidance and policies and laws are conflicting. So on the ground and in the fog of war, it's been difficult to implement the appropriate outsourcing policies. And lastly, I just want to note that history, culture, and leadership have issues as both facilitators and inhibitors of integration of operational contractors. And I wanted to note that because DoD as an institution is basically operating at an intersection of three systems: the environment, the actors, and the structure. And for DoD leaders who are thinking about how to improve their operational contracting, Molly said this earlier, but I'm going to echo it. So they have control over DoD personnel, and somewhat they have control over structure. But there's a lot of this integration that's outside of the chain of command, and it's outside of their control. So basically what I'm recommending and what I want to sort of put across today is that DoD leaders should try to control the things that they can and get as best prepared for the contingencies as they can in the future. So to sum up, basically, in looking at governance, DoD leaders should think about the personnel relationships and comparison. They should try to promote the institutional facilitators that are good and as they can. Try to reconcile the laws, policies, and guidance for when it actually needs to be interpreted in the fog of war, and clarify esprit de corps and what that means for the force, and seek to understand contractors' motivations and financial experiences better than we have today. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Caroline. Next, we have retired Colonel Mark Cancian, who's a senior advisor with the Center for Strategic and International Studies International Security Program. He joined CSIS in April 2015 from the Office of Management and Budget, where he spent more than 7 years as chief of the Force Structure and Investment Division. Previously, Mark worked on force structure and acquisition issues in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and ran research and executive programs at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Colonel Cancian spent over 3 decades in the U.S. Marine Corps, serving as an infantry, artillery, and civil affairs officer, and on overseas tours in Vietnam, Desert Storm, and twice to Iraq. Colonel Cancian is also an adjunct faculty member at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and he graduated with high honors from Harvard College with the highest honors from Harvard Business School. With that, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I'm going to focus on one element of this issue, and that is contractors and U.S. force structure. To give you the bottom line up front, contractors have become a permanent part of our force structure. One of the 4 elements, that is with regular forces, reserve and guard, and government civilians. Most of the attention, however, gets focused on a small part of those contractors. Most contractors do quite unobjectionable logistics and administrative work, but the piece that is armed and interacts with adversaries and outside the wire is the element that gets most of the attention. Let me see if I can figure this one out here. Let's see. All right. Well, not like what we're going to talk about today. Okay, we can jump through that in the interest of time. Okay, I'm going to look at the Army here because they're, of course, the largest service, and they do most of the contracting in theater because they have so many theater-wide responsibilities. There have been a number of studies about Army tooth to tail over history. The historical brigade size there, that comes from studies from Second World War, Korea, Vietnam. Most of those studies were actually at the division level, and I've divided them in thirds to get a brigade slice because that's the way the Army is organized now. And what they found, and it's quite consistent over history, is that there's an element that's actually in the combat division, and then there's support outside the division. That would be at corps and theater level, and that's both combat support and combat service support. When you look at Iraq, you find that the brigade slice is about the same size as it has been historically, but a big chunk of that is now provided by contractors in both the combat support and combat service support. Here you can see contractors over time in CENTCOM. A couple of things I want to point out. First, you can see the three elements of the contracted force. That is, you have U.S. citizens, you've got what are called third country nationals, and then you have locals. And the second thing is you can see that the number has gone down over time as U.S. commitments in Iraq and Afghanistan have declined, but it bottomed out and is now actually starting to climb back up again as the U.S. Continues to be involved in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. The other thing is, if you look at the ratio of contractors to military, it was about 1-to-1 at the height of the conflicts in about 2008 or so. It's been increasing in Afghanistan. It's now 2-to-1 contractors to soldiers, but it's lower in Iraq, 1-to-2. And that may be driven by the fact that Iraq is a operational theater without the large FOBs that you see in Afghanistan, where you have a lot of contracted support. So it's hard to say whether over time this dependence has been increasing. There's no question that it's much greater today than, of course, it has been in the past. I want to talk a little about what contractors do. And here you can see the breakdown that CENTCOM, Central Command, uses describing contractors. And most of them are in logistics and administrative functions. You can see the total numbers down here for Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. There are also some in Central Command that are not in those countries. You'll see those on the next slide. But it's these 2,000 that get most of the attention. That is the 5% in the personnel security detachments, the PSDs. These are the armed contractors that guard VIPs, high value personnel. They go outside the wires, and those are the ones that have been involved in some of the incidents that you've heard about. I would say 90% of the discussion on contractors is about these 2,000. And the point I would make is it's fair to talk about those 2,000, but the other 95% of contractors are not armed and are performing, I say, relatively benign logistics and administrative functions. Now, there are a couple of asterisks in there, and that some of the interrogators, for instance, at Abu Ghraib, who are in a different line there, I mean, they were drawn into some of these scandals. And there are some security contractors who are not in the PSDs, but most of those are around the FOBs. Those are the ones who are guarding the mess hall and guarding the PX, and mostly inside the wire. This gives you a little sense about who the contractors are and where they are. This also includes contractors in other locations in Central Command, not just in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. You can see the breakdown between the different kinds. Interesting thing, as I mentioned before, in Iraq and Syria, it's about 1 for 1. In other locations, it's also 1 for 1, but in Afghanistan, it's about 2 contractors to 1 military personnel. Okay, so how did we get here? Why now do we have such a dependence on contractors? And as you can see, the 2 factors are there's a continuing burden of operations, and we have a smaller force. On the upper left, that comes from a RAND study, and it makes the point that after the end of the Cold War, the United States is involved in many more overseas deployments. People have said that the end of the Cold War made the world safe for regional conflict, and we're seeing that in U.S. deployments, which have not gone down. There was a thought in the Obama administration that we would be pulling out of the Middle East and from Europe, and that has not happened. And then a number of military personnel, of course, have come down during that same period. So you have more demands on a smaller force. Another factor is that military personnel are expensive and getting more expensive. And we don't have to go through all of the details on why that is true. Military personnel, when you load up all the costs, are really extremely expensive. And I say over the 2000s, they got much more expensive. Contractors, on the other hand, they're less expensive when you consider fully burdened cost, and that is costs that consider all of the benefits and overhead that go with personnel. And when you consider rotation base, that is for military personnel, you deploy them, they come home, another unit takes their place. With contractors, when they're at the end of their contract, they go home. You don't have to pay for a rotation base. And of course, they're easier to release when the task is completed. You don't get into problems about discharging people, who had been overseas and maybe in the military. And there's a lot of sensitivity to that with contractors. They just go. Another factor is troop caps. And you can argue about whether troop caps are a good idea or a bad idea. A lot of people say that they're a bad idea. But the fact of the matter is every president has used them. And these are just some examples from recent history. And we don't have to go through all the details except to make the point that every president has put troop caps on deployments. And those troop caps have not included contractors. So that has given the forces another incentive to use contractors. And one example I didn't put up here was Plan Colombia, where the troop cap was 0. It was done entirely with contractors and with locals who did a great job. Different counting methodologies about the troop caps, and there's a lot of discussion, controversy about how the caps are actually calculated, but they all exclude contractors. Some people say, okay, well, what about conscription? In fact, we had a little argument about that over lunch. And my argument is conscription is not an answer for a couple of reasons, and I can talk about some of these. Conscription is also unpopular with the American people. It's unpopular with the military. It's unpopular with the politicians. So that in itself is pretty fatal. There are a bunch of other problems with that, so we can talk about those. Okay, so what do you do? Well, a number of the panelists have talked about the things that DoD is already doing, and want to give DoD credit for what it has been doing. We're in a very different situation than we were, say, in 2005 to 2008, when a lot of these structures were not in place to protect the government and its interests. And I don't want to go through all of these. One of the most important, though, is that first bullet, creating deployable contract teams. There was a commission called the Gansler Commission, and one of their major recommendations was that the Army needed to have teams that could go into theater very quickly and handle this rush of contracting, something they had not done in 2003 and that was open, therefore, to abuses. The Army has now created those teams. And, a bunch of liaison efforts that people have talked about. The directives, legal foundations, expanding the UCMJ and other structures to hold contractors accountable. And the last box there I think is an important one. That is, well-behaved contractors don't make the news. And you may have noticed or not noticed that you haven't heard about contractors for a long time. And the reason is that these structures that we have put in place are having an effect. That is, you are not hearing about scandals and about incidents the way maybe you heard during the 2000s. So I think we can argue that all of these actions have been have had some effect. So what are some things we might continue to do? The first one is about fully costing of manpower categories. And this is a broader issue than just contractors. It includes government civilians and active reserve mixes. Because the problem is when you're trying to compare costs from these different manpower categories, the costs typically include different things. There was an infamous example some years ago where a member of Congress, who shall remain nameless, said, contractors cost $300,000 a year, a sergeant costs $60,000 a year, we're paying 5 times as much for a contractor. Now, the $60,000, of course, doesn't include any of the benefits, it doesn't include any of the overhead, it doesn't include a lot of the expenses that contractors or any contractor has to roll in to its cost structure. For example, if you go to RAND and ask them, what does a man-year cost? You get a very high number, not all of which goes to the good doctor, because that covers the overhead and the office and that sort of thing. And you sometimes hear arguments, well, they're really expensive. Well, no, they're probably cheaper than the government when you include all of the costs. The costing structure has been set, though. DOD, in its analytic arm, it's called, the organization's called CAPE, has done the intellectual work to line up these cost elements. They just haven't had the courage, really, to put numbers in there. I mean, everybody can agree about what a sergeant's compensation is, but when it comes time to putting a number on the value of benefits, what's the value of the daycare center, the PX, the commissary, all the kinds of things that military personnel can take advantage of, those benefits, but that contractors don't have. Rolling those numbers in gets very controversial, so they've sort of stalemated on that. But they're going to need to push that forward if they're going to make decisions, not just about contractors and government civilians and the government, but if you're going to make a decision about, back in the United States, if you're going to contract out some activity, the dining facility, for example, you need to have those numbers to make those decisions. You also need it for active reserve mix, which still continues to be a tension. And the second thing is clearly delineating who does what. For contractors, one element is deciding, all right, what a contractor is going to do and what are we going to have military forces do. I had a conversation actually with an Army general who made the comment, well, we ought to get rid of these contractors because there were just too many of them. So I said, well, okay, how many BCTs are you willing to give up to buy back all those logistics spots? He said, well, you can't give up any BCTs. They're all necessary. And I said, well, there's your answer, that the BCTs, that is the brigade combat teams, which have the combat forces, are more important than buying a lot of logistics units. But the department has not come up with a way of thinking about how to make that division, okay? I mean, you get a lot of, assign, functions to the most appropriate component, not very helpful. And especially the personal security details, because if you wanted to, you could replace all of them with military personnel. The problem is that you're going to give up a lot of good NCOs, pull them out of squads and platoons to build these personal security detachments, and you may not want to do that. And you also need this for what I call the blue-hair soldier problem. And the blue-hair soldier problem is a debate I've had going with Jackie Schneider up at Naval War College. And it's about cyber personnel. Her argument was relax military standards so you can bring in people with cyber backgrounds. And my argument is no, we need those skills, but they ought to be in contractors or civilians. You don't need to change military standards and allow blue-hair soldiers to get the use of those skills. But again, that's another debate that the department is having right now. All right, one more. And I make an analogy to the integration of reservists. Back in 1970, the department announced a total force policy where it was going to rely more on reservists. Reservists are no longer going to be the strategic reserve that was only going to be called up in the event of a big war, but they were going to be used more, not quite day to day, but for regional conflicts. And there were a whole bunch of questions that came up and a lot of discomfort in the active duty planning organizations about the use of reservists. I could also add, how will they integrate? Will they show up? Will they be qualified? Is it ethical to use them? All questions that have been asked about contractors. And it took about 30 plus years, and I'd say it took about 40 years. It was really from 1970 until maybe the mid-2000s before DoD planners figured out how to use reservists in a way that made them effective, but also recognized that they come from a different background and that you needed to have different processes and mechanisms for bringing them into the force. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Colonel Cancian. And last but not least, we have Mr. Chris Rothery. Chris Rothery is a senior lecturer with the Center for Defense and Security Studies at Massey University in New Zealand. Chris has a Master of Military and Defense Studies degree from the Australian National University and a Master of Arts degree from the University of Waikato. He is also a graduate from the Australian Command and Staff College. Chris served 21 years as Combat Engineer Officer in the New Zealand Army and held a variety of command positions within the Engineer Regiment, including serving as a commander for a Combat Engineer Squadron and the Emergency Response Squadron. Chris also held the post as the Chief Instructor at the School of Military Engineering. In addition to his regimental positions, Chris served as the Director of Army Recruiting and the Operations Officer within the Deployable Joint Interagency Task Force. Chris has conducted operational tours to East Timor and Afghanistan, as well as several humanitarian and disaster relief missions domestically and in the Pacific. With that, Chris, we'll turn it over to you.
Right, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank University of North Georgia for this invitation to come and speak here this afternoon. I'm here with the Director of the Centre for Defence and Security Studies, Dr. Ruben Azizian, and we look forward to a very long and rewarding collaboration between our two very fine institutions. But this afternoon I'm going to take you on a slightly different journey in regards to private security contractors, and I'm going to focus my talk on the challenges faced by New Zealand citizens when they return from their work as private security contractors. To do this, it is important to explain New Zealand. Now, Boaz, I put the pink arrows there so you know where New Zealand is, and how we as a nation view and interact within the world in relation to conflict and global security. The national understanding of the private security industry, what work they carry out, what contribution New Zealand has made, and the issues surrounding support to these contractors will also be explored. On the 17th of September, the New Zealand government announced the extension of the troop commitment to the coalition training team with the Australian Defence Force in Iraq. The mission, currently our largest deployment, has 100 soldiers working with the Australians, training the Iraqi army at Camp Taji, north of Baghdad. This news appeared on the national news broadcasts. The story was run by the main news agencies. There was some public debate regarding the extension. However, by the next day, the reporting of the story had pretty much concluded. This was because that same weekend, the All Blacks were defeated by the Springboks. This very significant but very rare event continued to be examined and discussed for much of the following week. We also had the opportunity to see how the world viewed this great tragedy. Ironically, the week before, the retired Chief of the New Zealand Defence Force, Lieutenant General Tim Keating, reflected on how he felt that the general population held sports stars in higher regard than that of the military. His main point was that there was very little recognition for the work carried out by the military or even a general understanding of what the military does for New Zealand. This isn't because New Zealand is a land of rugby-mad people ignorant to the world. Our location and our environment has shaped the way in which we as a nation view the happenings around us. New Zealand has never been invaded. There were wars fought within the country during the early colonisation of the British in the mid-1800s. However, New Zealand has not experienced the same sort of conflict or terrorist attacks that many in this room have. This splendid isolation, as we call it, has been the country's best security measure, and it means that events that many experience are not part of our daily lives. This does not mean that national security and our nation's contribution to international security is not taken seriously by the government. The New Zealand security organisations to continue to support a range of missions around the world. However, our contribution is often small and is often not in the areas of most extreme danger. The main security concerns for New Zealand are climate change, biosecurity issues and threats to our international trade. Therefore, military operations and the subsequent impact that these operations have on those that serve is not widely understood by the general New Zealand public. This view of security and of conflict impacts the way in which the nation understands how to support those that have served, as both members of the military and also as members of private security firms. New Zealand's first experience with private military contractors was with the former service persons taking up work in the demining and UXO clearance operations. In the early 1990s, New Zealand deployed troops to assist with humanitarian mine clearance missions in Asia and in Africa. These were the first major deployments New Zealand had since the Vietnam War. It was from this group that many would find work with international demining and UXO clearance organisations. Many of the New Zealand miners that I interviewed had spent well over a decade demining in the Middle East, the Balkans, Asia and in Africa. It is this group that is considered the forgotten generation of not only our military veterans, but also that have worked in the wider private military contracting environment. They deployed towards the end of the Cold War into states that for many years had been hidden behind oppressive regimes, and their stories and deployments, or their stories of their deployments and their work in private security is often akin to a Wild Western plot. With one I spoke to, one of my former COs, was how he was deployed to the northern area of Cambodia with a borrowed AK-47 and some grenades as his only protection. But once you get past these stories of bravado and daring, the conversations generally turn to discussions of others that are having significant personal issues related not only to their service but also their times as private security work. These individuals are showing significant signs of PTSD. However, very few are seeking the necessary help. When I spoke with these veterans, some were registered with Veterans Affairs New Zealand, our primary veterans care organisation. But what is apparent about this group is that they do not want to be a burden on the support system and would often prefer to deal with the issues by themselves. The events of 2001 and the conflict in the Middle East has led to an evolution in New Zealand's experience with the private security environment. New Zealand's initial deployment in 2001 to Afghanistan was predominantly with our Special Forces unit, the Special Air Service. A provincial reconstruction team was deployed to the Bamiyan province from 2003 to 2013, and in 2003 an engineer element deployed to Iraq to assist in humanitarian and reconstruction work in the country's southeast. It was from these early deployments that many took up private security work, and it wasn't just the Special Forces units that worked overseas. Many regular units lost people to private security companies. The reason for many of these people leaving was, of course, for money. Those that were interviewed all spoke of how they could almost triple their salary, and many viewed this as an opportunity to help with their family's financial security. In 2004, the New Zealand government was very concerned about the loss of so many overseas contractors and implemented a new law that would attempt to stop New Zealanders from taking up private security work. The Mercenary Activities Prohibition Act was rushed through Parliament and implemented in July 2004. Commentators suggest that this law did little to stop the flow of service persons taking up overseas private security work and has been criticised for having an ambiguous and outdated content. The issue surrounding the law is the ambiguity between the description of what a mercenary is and what a mercenary is not. To be considered a mercenary under this Act, you would be taking part in hostilities in a conflict area, you would not be part of a nation's armed force, and also you would be making private gain from those hostilities, or sorry, those activities. However, if you took part in private security work that was for humanitarian operations, such as mine clearance, logistic support, or domestic policing activities, then you are not considered a mercenary. You just cannot be taking part in hostilities or making private gain. So there is quite a lot of confusion around that. If this law is applied, then our former Minister of Defence is considered a mercenary. The Honourable Mark Mitchell, and prior to his military career or his political career, the former policeman worked in Iraq in the private security sector, firstly with the company Controlled Risks and then with the company that he was CEO for, Threat Management Group. He undertook a range of different roles, from negotiating to training security forces to providing security to personnel and facilities. Under the current legislation, Mark Mitchell can be considered a mercenary and able to be prosecuted by this law. Unsurprisingly, Mark Mitchell is very supportive of the work that private security companies do, and more importantly, that the government has a responsibility in providing support to those that have worked overseas. He is also very critical of the Mercenaries Act. Governments, including New Zealand, are using private security companies to support their international commitments and is a normal part of governments doing business and a way of moving risk to the private sector. They are, according to him, enablers in restoring peace. Mark Mitchell is of the view that anyone who has worked in private security sector should be granted the same recognition and support that is afforded to members of the armed forces. He cited the case where the British nationals working as private security contractors were awarded the Reconstruction Service Medal for their work assisting the British efforts in Iraq. Unfortunately for New Zealand, there does not exist any reliable data, or data, as you Americans like to call it, on the number of New Zealanders that have worked in this industry. The only information that could be found was an article that was published in 2008 that estimated between 500 to 2,000 New Zealanders had worked overseas. And this is where the main issue lies. There is no knowledge of how many New Zealanders have worked overseas as private security contractors, or what impact their work has had on their physical and mental health. As the majority of these individuals are veterans, there is an issue for them in receiving assistance from the Veteran Support Services. New Zealand has 2 government-sponsored veteran support agencies. The Return Services Association, which was established in 1916, and is a collection of independent local associations, which in itself is an issue. The RSA does not have a very good reputation with contemporary veterans, a contemporary veteran being someone who has served in the last 30 years. Many of the local RSAs do not fully understand the concept of private security for work. For that reason, they refuse to extend support to those veterans that have worked as contractors. According to Mark Campaign, the RSA's National Support Services Manager, he believes that New Zealand has to relearn the idea of having veterans in society. At present, under the Veterans Affairs, there are 4,000 cases of veterans. Of these, 166 cases are for veterans under the age of 60. The average age of veterans registered with Veterans Affairs is 80. The overwhelming response from those I interviewed is that the veteran support system is unfriendly and unsupportive, especially towards contemporary veterans. I, like many veterans I spoke to, gave up trying to apply for support through Veterans Affairs due to the overly fossilised layers of bureaucratic requirements, to say it nicely. The concern for many veterans relates to attributing their injuries to their military service. If your injury is a result of private security work, then you will receive no support from the veteran support system and are instead at the mercy of the public health system. The difficulties in obtaining support for veterans, especially for those that have worked as a private security contractor, is a direct result from the nation's nonchalant attitude towards veterans and former private security employees. However, it is not all in doom and gloom. There are other charitable trusts that provide support to veterans. One in particular, No Duff, is taking a very positive and forthright approach, especially if you can read Latin, to supporting veterans. As a charitable trust, they have no criteria for support, just that you need to have served in the military. NODUF is comprised of former service persons, and their founder and general manager, Aaron Wood, works with the RSA and Veterans Affairs to improve the way in which support to veterans is provided. As someone who has also worked as a private security contractor, Aaron understands the issue faced by those veterans that have worked in the private security industry, and is adamant that private security work should not prohibit a veteran from getting support. Those that have worked as a private security contractor within the veteran community should not have to rely on organisations such as NODUF to receive the support that they need. Instead, it should be the government-funded veteran support organisations that need to change their mindset and widen the support that they can provide. Conflict has changed. If the government is willing to employ the services of private military contractors, then these individuals should be given the same support they would if their injuries were a result of their military service. Support services should also be extended to those veterans that supported our nation's partners and allies in their security work. New Zealand spends more on drug rehabilitation than it does on veteran support, a situation that needs to change. And if anyone's wondering, we beat them in the return match. Sorry, Eddie.
You have to play another day.
Yeah. Right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, thank you very much. A great set of panelists here. I would like to turn it over for Q&A at this point. We're running a little bit short on time. So any questions?
Question's just for Mark, and since it was quiet, I figured a question for one person in particular. You mentioned the 1970 total force policy, and we have found since then that reservists, force structure-wise, are treated just like active duty. There's some differences, but we have a tendency to utilize them as a total force structure number. If we include contractors, at what point have we lost the differentiation between active duty and contractor support?
Well, I guess I'm not quite sure about your question. Lost the difference between active duty and contractor support?
Between the personnel, active duty personnel. Mm-hmm. If you include contractors as part of the total military force, how do active duty personnel differ from contract support personnel? Where do they, I'll let you go from there. I think.
Now I understand. Well, this gets at one of the efforts that I recommended, which is that the department should think about where it wants to draw the lines. My personal argument is you ought to have the military do things that only military should do. And that is, some places either where you're going to use force on a large scale, or, where you need that level of command and control, where you need, also when you need people who are, physically fit, medically perfect, haircuts, disciplined, all of those other things. And if you don't need that, then you probably don't need military personnel. And that's why I come back to cyber. This argument that has been going on about cyber, and it is still going on, that is, everyone agrees that the military needs cyber expertise. The only question is, how do you get it? Now, some people have said we should bring those people into the military, make them service members, but because they're all, overweight, pasty white, and smoking dope up in their room at 2 o'clock in the morning, we have to change our standards and our expectations about what a soldier is. So if they want to wear purple hair and have a man bun, we ought to let them do that so we can get their skills. My argument was, no, I don't think you should do that. You don't want to have two militaries, this one military that's physically fit, highly disciplined, and drug-free, and this other military that's not. You should make those people contractors, and you can still get their expertise, but you're not. You're much more flexible on personnel requirements. All right, and then I see.
Let me just comment. Differentiating between, call it IT cyber contractors and the rest. You already have a problem in the U.S. Army with not meeting the recruiting goal because of the amount of drug abuse, lack of physical fitness. And a recent study showed that the U.S. Army, 2/3, 66%, were overweight or obese. In the active duty U.S. Army, you already got a problem there.
I would even take that a little bit further. If you're going to have cyber people that you're going to allow to be different, why not people who do unique jobs, such as mentors to foreign militaries that are combating terrorism and conducting counter insurgent operations? Guys that can go out in groups of 3 or 4 or 5, have to have beards, have to have long hair, don't wear body armor. Maybe they should be considered like IT experts.
You mean and drawn from contractors? And I think we essentially do that. NPRI. I mean, that's so their business model. I don't know about the beard part, but what's it? But we've done that extensively.
Isn't it true that the who does what problem is not merely a problem of government versus private, it's also a problem contractor versus contractor? When you've got dozens of contractors in a particular area, and some of them are supposed to provide contract services to other contractors, that becomes a problem too. And I won't bore you with my personal experience with that, but it was a major security issue with us.
If I could just team onto that, two-finger on that one. I thought that it was really interesting that the majority of our panelists on this panel talked about the distinction between security and support contractors. And since this is a panel on governance law and ethical security, I just want to pose the question to all of the panelists. Should we have different thresholds for what is acceptable in a legal or ethical sense amongst different contractors based on the functions that they're performing, or should it depend on the client that they are working for and the jurisdiction, therefore, of the laws that are mandating that client, or should it be something about the hostility in the environment? Right now, it's probably the second thing more than anything, the jurisdiction of the laws, but I wonder what you all would think about that.
I'll take a stab. No, I mean, that was sort of what I was trying to get at in my presentation was, there is a difference when you are augmenting the provision of a public good and you're providing the public good itself. And in this case, the public good we're talking about is security, and it's just subject to a different set of economic norms and rules than private goods are. And when you're talking about the use of force on behalf of the state, I think that's a qualitatively different kind of enterprise than providing, logistics functions or IT support or cyber support or something that, so that's where I would draw the line. Am I augmenting or am I replacing? Am I acting in lieu of? And that's where the proxy relationship becomes an interesting framework, because that suggests, and I'm sorry about that busy slide, but the only reason I threw that up at the end was to show you can answer the question. There are norms that you can construct to address it, but all those norms aren't going to apply to a company that is running logistics for you and feeding your troops. It will apply when they are in the business of applying force and providing security as a public good.
All right, and with that, I think we have reached the end of our panel time. Do we have time for one more? Okay, one more question.
I'm sorry.
I want to ask a ethical question. If you read the works of Victor Davis Hansen and Martin von Crierfeld, they're basically arguing that we're moving away from Clausewitzian Western warfare, where we go in and we destroy and we sort of reboot if we go in. And so my question from an ethical perspective is whether our use of private military companies hasn't become an excuse for our militaries not doing their job.
I guess I'll take that one on too, unless somebody else wants to. Well, I'll try to just answer it briefly. You're right. We're going. I mean, so you're right that we're kind of getting away from that model. I mean, the U.S. military and we're wrestling with this at the doctrinal level right now, which is our concept is peace, 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 war, peace, 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 peace. Actually, most of the rest of the world doesn't function like that. You mentioned Clausewitz. While we're looking ways to impose our will on the enemy when we have one, a lot of the world is just trying to shape our interest, and they're happy to use military force in that role. Is the military not doing its job? Well, we're trying, I think, desperately to catch up to exactly how that would work. And in that gap, and that's why I made the point that PMCs fill the gaps where governments can't or they won't. And I think there's a role for that. But I think the rules and norms associated with shaping interests and imposing will are very different. And I'll leave it at that.
Something. I did a project last year about surprise in peer conflicts. And my argument was that we've lived through a generation where the U.S. was a supreme superpower and no one could really challenge us. We fought many regional conflicts, and some of those were difficult, but they didn't rise to the level of a peer conflict. We are now entering an era where we may have a peer conflict. And you know, the kinds of we're going to face a level of difficulty and challenge that we have not experienced for at least a generation. So we should not forget what the military is for and what high-end conflict might look like.
All right, I would like to just take this opportunity to thank our panelists again for a great talk.
Thank you. We're going to take a break now, and we're going to reconvene at 15:15. That's about 11 minutes from now, 3:15. Thank you. 1 minute warning. All right, let's move to our seats, please.
So good afternoon again. It's a privilege and honor for me to now introduce our next speaker, Mr. Erik Prince. Mr. Prince is a US-born entrepreneur, a philanthropist, a Navy SEAL veteran, and a private equity investor with business interests in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and North America. A strong supporter of economic development in emerging markets. He is the founder and chairman of Frontier Resource Group, a private equity firm that invests in transformative natural resource projects. He is also the chairman of Frontier Services Group, a company listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange that provides logistics and transportation services in Africa. Prior to establishing the Frontier Group of companies, Mr. Prince founded and ultimately sold Blackwater USA, a provider of global security, training and logistics solutions to the US government and others, which he sold in 2010, and Presidential Airways, a global transportation company with over 70 aircraft operating in emerging markets. Mr. Prince is married, and between himself and his wife Stacy, enjoy raising 12 children. He was educated at Hillsdale College in Michigan, and upon graduation joined the US Navy, where he served as a Navy SEAL officer until 1996. Mr. Prince's philanthropic endeavors are focused on refugees, humanitarian relief, and economic development. Mr. Prince's career of extensive professional engagements throughout the world give him a unique perspective on developing economic trends, opportunities, and risks to consider. Mr. Prince, thanks.
Good afternoon. They wanted me to talk about contractors, past, present, and future. So I will do a quick run through the past for maybe part of the education you didn't hear in class. America, remember, was started not by British soldiers, but it was started by companies. Companies like the Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Jamestown, companies that were listed on the London Stock Exchange. They hired people like John Smith and Miles Standish, professional private military contractors that had fought in Europe as soldiers for the crown, and they hired on as companies, as security, basically as a security manager to come over and help secure these colonies. Remember, the first elements of the U.S. Army were basically those Minutemen-type units formed by those colonies. Across the street from the White House, if you visit Washington, you'll find Lafayette Park, where someone in Washington thought enough of contractors 100 years ago to build statues to these guys. Lafayette, Rochambeau, von Steuben, Kosciuszko, foreigners, mercenaries, contractors that came and built the Continental Army. The first Inspector General of the U.S. Army, Baron von Steuben. The founder of American artillery, Kosciuszko, a Pole. There's even a 30-foot tall statue of him at West Point alone. Apostasy, imagine a contractor statue at West Point. At sea, 9 out of 10 ships taken during the American Revolution were taken by privateers. private ship, private crew, a profit motive. They had a hunting license that they got from Congress. It's called a letter of marque and reprisal. Go out and attack enemy shipping. And they did. They did well. Even George Washington, America's founding father, was an investor in a privateer. Fast forward a bit through the ages, through the century. Whether it's securing the West, securing infrastructure, the Pinkertons were, for many years, much larger than the United States Army. You had intelligence on the battlefield when Alan Pinkerton, the original private eye, was hired to do counterintelligence and security in a, you can imagine, a very split capital in 1862. Now, the U.S. military has never been a big adapter when it comes to change. They tend to adapt pretty slowly, right? And you think about a guy named William Gatling, who developed the Gatling gun, right? He developed it from a corn planter, and he tried to sell it to the U.S. Army in 1862. When there was a Civil War on, you think you'd want a nice high-fire weapon, high-speed weapon to fire. And the chief of U.S. Army Ordnance said, "Why would I want a gun that consumes so much ammunition?" But Gatling persisted. He eventually got a live-fire demo done for Abraham Lincoln on the National Mall out in front of the White House, and the Gatling gun came to be and then helped win the end of the war for the North. An aircraft, also an American invention. Okay, the Wright brothers persisted and finally launched that aircraft off a sand dune in North Carolina, and they flew it, and the U.S. Army wanted nothing to do with it. The French did. The French bought it first. The U.S. Army, we have aerostats and balloons. Why would we ever need an airplane? So again, the idea of the U.S. military, of the Pentagon not being quick adapters to what's changing, I'm not surprised. There's a lot of talk about Afghanistan earlier and what to do about contractors in Afghanistan, all the rest. So let me lay this scenario for you. Imagine you had a prime contractor whose sole responsibility was to build and stabilize the Afghan security forces, and they've been doing it for the last 17 years. They've consumed more than $1 trillion of U.S. taxpayer money. The U.S. taxpayers are on the hook for another $1 trillion in veterans' health care costs. And despite of that 17 years, now the friendly government only controls 30% of the terrain. The partner forces in country are losing hundreds per month. In fact, the attrition rate of the Afghan forces now is 3% per month. Dead, wounded, or deserted. You annualize out 3% a month, that's 36% a year. 36% of your force per year is out the door and gone, not to be replaced. A truly unsustainable number. 70%, right? If the whole reason the U.S. forces are in Afghanistan is to deny terror sanctuary, the friendly government only controls 30%. The other 70% is under the control or is regularly contested by the Taliban, by Daesh, or any of the other 20-some terror forces that are resident in Afghanistan. So I would call that a problem. Imagine if that was in the hands of one contractor, would you fire them? Or would you at least start to ask accountability questions as to what are we doing as a country, allowing that kind of paradigm to persist for 17 years? The military-industrial complex is a real thing. Okay? Everything that General Eisenhower warned about is real. Washington is about money and power. Okay? And people will say, they'll be concerned, wow, there's a profit motive in privatization of contractors and all the rest. Hey, we're spending as a country this year $62 billion in Afghanistan. We're spending $5 billion to support the Afghan security forces. That's the stroke of the check just to pay for the Afghan Army, police, and Air Force. $5 billion. We're spending $57 billion to support the U.S. presence there. Okay? So our 15,000 U.S. forces cost the taxpayers $57 billion. Now remember, that's money we don't even have. Look at the deficit the United States runs every year. Our deficit now is so large, $21 trillion, that even the Chinese debt portion of U.S. foreign debt holdings, our interest on that funds their defense budget. Okay? So for people to say, well, turning to contractors or privatization, rationalization, we can't do that. Hey, we have a very real debt problem. Maybe not right now, but the interest rates can't stay low forever. And remember, all that money we spend in deficit every year racks up that debt, and the interest payments they don't stay in America. So we have a problem. If our reason for being there was to deny terror sanctuary, that's a fail. Because clearly there's a lot of sanctuary because they can launch and attack Kabul, or, for heaven's sakes, 2 weeks ago, they put a gunman in the room with the U.S. commander, and they killed General Razak, a friend of mine. Okay, I had dinner with General Razak 3 weeks before he died. He was a big supporter of rationalization. What a brave man he was. They tried to kill him more than 24 times, and he didn't quit. They'd killed many of his family, and he didn't blink, he didn't quit, and a true warrior to the end. So we owe it to the Afghans to get it right. We owe it to ourselves to get it right, because if the mighty U.S. military, the most powerful and expensive military in the history of mankind, gets defeated by largely illiterate goat herders using very simple weapons, AKs, PKs, Dishkas, and homemade explosives, okay? We have a real problem because that empowers every jihadi crazy in the world. I walked through the Association of the U.S. Army's convention, and I cringe because they have all that stuff, all that equipment, tens of billions of dollars of stuff, of every kind of radar, communications gear, night vision, all the rest. And we're still losing to very, very basic, primitive tactics that are working. So we have to get this right. I have sons your age, and a couple of them will join soon. And the idea of them going to Afghanistan to get blown up or dead, I wanted no part of. I've been paying attention to peace in Afghanistan since 1998, when I funded Aloya Yurga, a peace conference. We were trying to get the king, Zahir Shah, to go back from his exile, comfortable exile in Rome, to go back and have a big peace conference long before 9/11. But alas, Rome was a little too comfortable and he didn't go. But I got to know a lot of those, a lot of the players in Afghanistan, and so I've kept in touch with them ever since. But seeing, I first got to Afghanistan in April of 2002, and that was right at the inflection point. Okay, right when we were going from a very special operations, unconventional warfare approach to where Bagram Air Force Base became a saluting zone. Okay, remember, after 9/11, okay, 5 days after 9/11, while the Pentagon is still smoldering, George Bush met with his National Security Cabinet at Camp David. And they needed a war plan. They needed to figure out what to do. This is what the Pentagon offered. They wanted to do a conventional invasion of Afghanistan via Pakistan, and they wanted to do it the following April. They didn't want to do anything that fall. They wanted to do missiles, bombs, and a Ranger raid. That's all the Pentagon, the most expensive military in the world, wanted to do in Afghanistan for the first 6 months of the conflict while their headquarters was still smoldering. It was the agency that said, Mr. President, give us authorities, $1 billion, and that, quote, and in 3 weeks, the flies will be walking on the eyeballs of our enemies. It was their approach, the way they'd done unconventional war in Africa and elsewhere the previous 2 decades, worked. Okay? You've seen the movie maybe 12 Strong. It's a small microcosm. There's a lot of case officers that went in that had contact with the warlords, with radios, money, air power, less than 100 SOF and CIA people, and they stomped the hell out of the Taliban in a matter of weeks with relentless pursuit. And believe me, you could drive around Kabul in a thin-skinned vehicle. That kind of relentless pressure, those guys were literally running for the hills, running for their lives. When we transitioned to a very conventional military approach that following spring, we've gone backwards ever since. We basically replicated the Soviet battle plan. Now there's absolutely a place for the conventional military, and that's in Fulda Gap, and that's in defeating Saddam's conventional army forces. But you're fighting now in Afghanistan against herdsmen, hillsmen, guys that will move into battle on foot, horse, or motorbike. Okay? We're not fighting motorized Soviet rifle regiments. Let's go back to what worked in the past. I wrote that op-ed a year ago, May, in the Wall Street Journal, calling for a different approach. I wrote it for an audience of one to read, and it worked. The president read it sitting at his desk. He circled it. He called in the National Security Advisor, said, I don't like your plan. I like this one. Do this. It probably didn't start things off on the right foot with General McMaster and me. But General McMaster is a 3-star Army officer who wanted his 4th star. General Kelly, 4-star Marine general, very conventional. I don't take anything away from his soldiering. Secretary Mattis, 4-star Marine general. Again, a very conventional approach. The idea of changing the paradigm and going back to something unconventional, haram, okay? Impossible. That being said, the White House still asked. They asked for a plan. They wanted a budget. Having been in Afghanistan for a lot of years and run thousands of people there, I had 56 aircraft there at one point serving the U.S. military, as big as the U.S. military is, with thousands of aircraft, okay? Biggest Air Force in the world, U.S. Air Force. Second biggest, U.S. Navy. Even despite all that, they still needed different kind of aircraft to do that mission. We had 56 birds there. So I went through a plan with my old team and came up with the following, right? We had to address 3, I think, fatal failings. And even Secretary Mattis, once I gave him the brief at the NSC, he said, my analysis of the root problems were the best that he saw. 1, we've never figured out or fixed the continuity issue in Afghanistan. U.S. military deploys, maybe the Marine Corps goes for 6 months, Army would go for 8 or 10 or 12 months, or maybe a little bit longer. They spend the first few months getting to know the area. Next few months, they're productive. Last few months, making sure everybody goes home. Pack up the inventory, turn over, leave. You lift that unit up, send it back to the States, never to return again to the same area, ever. Send a new unit in, repeat. We've done that 30 rotations now. Einstein had a word for that. It's called insanity. Okay? You have no continuity in that area. But the Taliban, they're not commuting to war. They've been there. The Taliban that have survived are smart soldiers. They know exactly how long the U.S. aircraft takes to show up, how they target, how the U.S. patrols, all the rest. I figured basically replicating the Afghan commando model, which is mentored and trained by the U.S. Special Forces counterparts. And let me just add one difference. And this is, again, different role between Special Forces and conventional forces. In a Special Forces unit, you equip the man. The man is the weapon system, okay? Because you're not carrying a lot of stuff into battle with you. In a conventional military, it's the artillery, the rockets, armor, does the fighting, the heavy fighting and the killing, okay? You man the equipment. It is a fundamental paradigm difference, and we need both. But fighting against guys on motorbikes and flip-flops, you probably need to fight a little lighter and a little faster. So using that Special Forces model, I'd put a 36-man mentor team into every Afghan battalion. And because they're Special Forces veterans, chances are they've been to that area before. We've already used that skill set. The taxpayers have already paid for it. Everybody loves to praise veterans on Veterans Day, but then they like to call them mercenaries if they go back as contractors. No, they're veterans volunteering to serve their country yet again. But I can pay them to go in there longer term. They're going to go in for 90 days, home for 30. Back in for 90, home for 30. But they'll go there 2 and 3 and 4 years to the same valley with the same battalion. They know good mullah from bad mullah. They know the village chief. They know the orphan lady or the widowed lady on the corner. They know the area. And believe me, they'll have continuity with that unit and that bond of brotherhood in war. Those mentors will make darn sure that Afghan battalion is paid on time and fed on time, that they're supplied and they're trained and they operate. And those mentors, okay, they're not going to be using excessive force. And if they are, there's a means to that. We'll get to that. But they're going back to the same area in that same valley. They have to build that continuity in that area to dominate that battle space. If the Afghans know that there's a professional, that their big brother is with them and going outside the wire with them every day. I went with a 36-man team, right? Normally you have a 14-man Special Forces A team, and they say an A team can build a battalion. I needed a bigger, a fatter mix this time so that we had enough mentors to go down to the company and even platoon level so that whenever an Afghan unit left the wire, there'd be professionals with them. So they could call an air, fire support plan, medical, comms. Those essential combat enablers. So that's one. Another important point of that, they would not be serving as U.S. military contractors. They would be serving as Afghan Army, as adjuncts in the Afghan Army, which even by UN definition makes them not mercenaries. Okay? They're in the Afghan chain of command. If we believe in an Afghanization of the effort, well, then let the Afghans hire for it. Okay? Stop dictating everything from the Pentagon and from CENTCOM and give the Afghans a little bit more means to sort it out. You can give them more operational control. The financial control can still stay with a U.S. control structure. Second, air power. Just like what worked with Special Forces guys on horseback, calling in B-52s, having reliable air power is essential. I cringe. I get really angry when you read on an almost daily basis about yet another Afghan base getting surrounded and overrun and annihilated. 30 dead, 20 wounded. 60 dead, 20 wounded, 20 captured. And they're dying ugly. Okay? Why? Because the Taliban rolls in with 200, 400, 500 guys. Amazing how with all of our surveillance capability, the Taliban can still move that many people. I find that embarrassing. But if they do, it's a wonderful opportunity to surround and maneuver on them and to destroy them. Reliable air power, again, contractor in one cockpit, Afghan in the other. Afghan tail numbers, Afghan rules of engagement. To include strike aircraft, helicopter gunships, lift, medevac, and resupply. When that poor Afghan base commander right now is surrounded in day 2, day 6, day 8, and nobody's evacuated, is dead or wounded, he's out of ammo, and he finally surrenders and gets slaughtered. Come on. That's unacceptable. It is happening on a weekly, if not daily basis in Afghanistan today. Despite the fact that we're spending $62 billion, who's accountable for that? I used to have a lot of aircraft in country. We got into the airdrop business because of an exact example like that. In 2005, there was a company-sized unit of the 82nd Airborne in a big firefight. And some of their support guys came to us on the ramp. And they said, our guys are running out of ammo. No one will drop ammo to them because the Air Force won't do it because it's not a surveyed drop zone. Will you guys do it? My guys, my airplanes, of course they said yes. Good Samaritan rule always applied in our company. And off they went. The Army guys put the drop zone panel on the hood of the Hummer, and the first bundle hit the hood of the Hummer less than an hour later from a cold stop, no prior planning. So it's not that hard to do the basics right, but sadly, after 17 years, the Pentagon has bureaucratized itself into stasis, into the point of all that stuff and all those resources, and they can't seem to organize to do some of those basics. So again, if you have the Taliban that's maneuvered and they have 400 or whatever conventional fight they're going to give you that day, that we're not using our mobility capability to surround them, because remember, there's not a lot of superhighways in Afghanistan. There's no 4-lane roads, maybe one. But when the Taliban's maneuvering, they're on motorbike or foot. The ability to block them in by blocking 2 or 3 arteries with a small blocking force, like the Rhodesian Fire Force would have done, to surround and destroy them. That's why the Fire Force killed 87% of the people they came in contact with. We adopt that tactic in Afghanistan, and you'll have a very different turnaround. If you show video of 100 Taliban dead getting pushed into a ditch by a bulldozer, message sent. But we haven't done that since 2001. The third part, governance. Now, this is not governance in terms of governing villages. I would say it's in the logistics support of the Afghan military. You have a huge ghost soldier problem, right? Huge over-reporting of middle commanders of the amount of people because they're skimming the payroll. Because you're going to have mentors now at every battalion doing a head count and an ammo count and a weapon count. Very simple, okay? Not only do you get a better promotion report as to who should be the next NCO or the next officer based on merit, not based on their bribe or their tribe or their religion, which is how it works now in the Afghan forces. But you can eliminate the overpayment, the ghost soldier issue. You have to make sure that the men are paid, fed, and led. There are 7 Afghan corps, and there's 7 distribution facilities through which all the food, fuel, parts, and ammunition flows. That's your nexus of corruption. You put some logistics controllers there, basically guys with clipboards or barcodes, and you monitor. Now remember, this is just to control the $5 billion that you're spending on the Afghan forces. All the personnel I've talked about, the guy in the previous panel said 6,000. That's about right. It's about 3,600 mentors. It's about 1,500 for the air wing, another 1,500 or so in governance support. The other piece of governance support is combat medicine. You're 7 times as likely to die if you're an Afghan soldier, if you get wounded. A lot of times guys are dying a week, 2 weeks later at some remote outpost because they can't even get antibiotics. So they're dying from a wound that goes septic. Unacceptable. Okay? People fight harder if they know someone actually cares and will patch them up. And again, we have violated that trust in Afghanistan. So that's why people are voting with their feet and deserting, and you have a 3% attrition per month. So, again, what does it take to do that? 6,000. You have 30,000 contractors in country right now. So this is not a privatization. Any business guy would look at this and say that's a rationalization. Okay? The total bill for the 6,000 that I lay out with all the aircraft, 91 aircraft, all the food, fuel, ammunition, including all the ordnance those aircraft would drop once a week. Okay? It's a heavy, I don't do things light in that sense. Comes to $3.7 billion. Okay? You keep your $5 billion for your Afghan security forces, 3.7. You keep another $2 billion for 2,000 U.S. SOF to stay in country. You keep a unilateral direct action capability, and they're the quality oversight management. You embed some of those guys across every one of those battalions, and so you have a U.S. E8, E9, SFNCO, or staff officer doing overall command and control and quality observation to see and to verify what's going on. It allows you to do a real rationalization. Like I said, 70% of the country is not under the control of the government. There's lots of places to do a trial run. Rough places like Nangarhar, Helmand, and sadly even many parts of the north. So we'll see. Nothing lasts forever. I know the president is upset about the total lack of progress. We were just about there in convincing him a year ago in August, but the race riot, the terrible thing that happened in Charlottesville, pounded him politically. He didn't want to make a big change. But I think the Pentagon got everything they wanted, and I don't think any observer, please be honest with ourselves, who could say that our 17 years, trillions of dollars, 2,400 U.S. dead, tens of thousands of wounded, has been a raging success? I would disagree. And look, I've got a lot of other things. I spend most of my time mining and looking for natural resources in weird places of the world. This would be a passion project. The private sector can do this. The business of America is business. It's not warfare. And I think one of the real problems in our statecraft, call it the continuum of statecraft, right? You have diplomacy, embassies, international conferences on one end, and the other end you have strategic nuclear triad, carrier battle groups, armored divisions, and you have that big mushy middle. okay, which is where the intelligence world should be. Where you have political warfare, covert action, subversion. This is the kind of thing, and this kind of effort, we should go back to, again, what worked after 9/11. The United States went into Afghanistan. It was under Title 50 authorities, right? The B-52 pilot was chopped. His chain of command was the director of Central Intelligence. It was not CENTCOM, okay? Those SF guys went in under the authorities and direction of the CIA director, Title 50. When the SEALs went cross-border into Pakistan to get bin Laden, Title 50. The Title 50 authorities have existed since 1947 in the Intelligence Act back then to handle these kind of areas of the continuum in the middle. The problem is when we've got away from doing that, it makes everything tilts towards a DoD solution. And with it comes a huge expense, a fairly clumsy approach in a lot of cases. We're trying to mow the lawn with a Porsche, okay? You can do that, but it's expensive and it doesn't help you get around the edges very well. So again, go back to what's worked. You know, there's a lot of noise made about Iran-Contra, right, during the 1980s. There was 19 other covert action programs that were run directed at dropping the Soviet Union. And they did it by being clever and nimble and fast, and it worked. We have it there is a reservoir of talent and capability and innovation to do this, and let's not get defeated by a bunch of barbarians that don't view what we have here as a way of life that's acceptable to them. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Erik. That was a great presentation. 2 questions. Can you talk about the length of time that you anticipate this type of activity would need to go on? We saw in Evan Barlow's presentation this morning how he said that once STEP pulled back out, Boko Haram resurged. And so what are your thoughts on how pervasive that would need to be? And then secondly, where will you get the personnel for this? What nationality would they be drawn from?
Sure. Look, time, we've been there for 17 years. This is not a 6-month fix, but what I will say is since I sold Black Order in 2010, and for 2.5 years I was focused on counter-piracy, okay, off the coast of Somalia. You probably haven't heard of much piracy off the coast of Somalia anymore. Something worked. But we've been looking for minerals, and there is an enormous mineral and energy potential in Afghanistan if you could just set security long enough. Okay, so if you have a reliable battalion in the area that can pacify an area, then you can attract the private capital to build. Okay, sadly, the Soviets did a better job of developing the natural resources of Afghanistan than we have. The United States has. And if you build a mine, right, there's a place like Mas Ainak. It's 50 kilometers south of Kabul. It's the largest copper deposit in the world. More than 6 million tons of copper. Do it manually. I would employ 10,000 Afghans with picks and shovels and pay them $12 a day. The Taliban's paying 10, we pay 12, right? You do that in enough of those places and you literally suck the manpower away from the enemy. Most of the Taliban are not super committed Islamists. Most of them are fighting for pay. So, short answer, I'd say the full model of what I lay out, 6,000, you probably need that for the first year and a half. And then you go on about a 20% a year drawdown, down to zero. The East India Company lasted for 250 years with that model of one mentor to 19 locals. And I'm not saying we're not there to colonize Afghanistan, quite the opposite. We want a Afghanistan that can stand on its own and protect what's inside its own borders. But you're leaving some kind of skeletal structure support, even if it's very thin, to make sure pay, manpower, supply is under control. You have a huge gap covered. And your second question was? Where will you get the personnel from? What nationality? Yes. I would use, my planning, use 60% American, 40% from NATO, Aussie, Kiwi, South African. Anybody with a good rugby team? Look, the NATO countries, however well-meaning, are so fraught with political limitations. One group can't cross a road, another group can't patrol at night. It's a joke, okay? It's a joke because they're being run by their bureaucracies back in their home countries, not by their leaders on the ground. Individual augmentees, okay? A team of Germans, South Africans, French, Brits, Poles, it would be very well together. And I want a little bit of competition between the battalion mentors, okay, for who patrols the most, who controls the most terrain. And I want that kind of innovation that comes from the experience they've had in different kinds of warfare all over the place. The aviators, not hard to find a crew to fly those kind of combat missions for 90 aircraft. The guys would be lining up. Just like I know guys would be lining up for the mentor mission. At the mere mention or the press reports, I have an inbox full of people looking to do that, and especially veterans that want to go back and do it right and that care about seeing the mission done properly. And I think as a country, we want to see proper closure on this, right? America had a big scar for a long time because of Vietnam, and I don't think anybody wants to see helicopters off the roof of the embassy, or actually the image that you saw in Vietnam was a CIA safe house. But all the same, that is a bad image for all of civilization if that happens. And if we abandon Afghanistan, that's exactly what will happen. Even Ghani himself, the president of Afghanistan, said, without U.S. support, we would last 6 months. I would say that's a stretch. It's way less than that.
Your views on China in Afghanistan, sir?
So China is very concerned about Afghanistan because of the Uyghurs, or the Uyghurs. Okay, the Uyghurs are a Turkic people that live up in Xinjiang province up in the northwest. And the Uyghurs have had many hundreds of them fighting and learning and training in Syria, and are some pretty committed jihadists. And there's some sanctuary also in Badakhshan in the northeast part of Afghanistan where they can train and equip and all the rest. The Chinese do not have an experience with dealing with kind of counterinsurgency. They've had some really bad Uyghur terrorism that makes them very, very concerned, right? They did, like in Nanjing at the train station, there was a knife attack and 4 Uyghurs killed 29 people with knives, okay? Let alone if they have firearms or explosives, all the rest. So, look, Russia is concerned about Afghanistan because jihad can work its way north. From there, China has an issue. Pakistan, here's another issue. The Pakistanis have been sticking it to us for a long time and playing both sides. And for all the noise about putting more pressure on Pakistan, the fact is we can't, because the very thirsty logistics lines of the Pentagon run right through Karachi. Okay, so as tight as we want to squeeze Pakistan, they can choke those supply lines as well. If we go to a much smaller, lighter footprint, like I've advocated, you come in from the north, and then you can really, then you can put all sorts of pressure on Pakistan from there. Sir.
So to continue our conversation from lunch, if you were going to do a pilot program, just a piece of your concept, what piece would that be?
The absolute minimum, the thing that they need more than anything is air right now. If you had reliable air that would show up, okay, as simple as, in Vietnam, the Puff the Magic Dragon guys would actually give out cards with a radio call sign and frequencies that when your fob is under attack, you call, we haul, right? They show up and they do it. At minimum, we should be doing that. It's the same thing we did for U.S. forces, but there are so many places that are in such bad guy hands that there's lots of places to do this without stepping on DoD toes. A few mentor teams, but I wouldn't put mentor teams in without our own reliable air to show up, because I have that little confidence in the U.S. military showing up in a timely manner. Not because of the individual pilot's bravery, because of the bureaucracy that literally prevents them from doing their job. We've allowed lawyers to become in America what Zompolits were in the Soviet Union. If you don't know what a Zompolit is, watch the movie The Hunt for Red October, okay? Because the Soviets, on every ship, every squadron, every division would have a Soviet political officer whose job was to make sure that the unit was complying with the whim of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And sadly, I think lawyers have restrained the individual field commanders' leeway to go do their job.
This is more a comment than a question. I was just struck by, firstly, the almost the same kind of ideas generated by Ibn this morning and how it corresponds with what you are saying now. Secondly, if you have done a study of the counterinsurgency campaign in Namibia, you will find a lot of what you are talking about in the campaign that the South Africans conducted in the 1970s, 1980s. And it basically boiled down to take local forces, train them well, let them be led very well by...
And keep training wheels on them.
Oh, yeah.
Like a bike.
Absolutely. But you're basically fighting the war with locals that are very well led, whilst they are very well trained, and you support them with air power, medical and intelligence support that goes with that. And I should say Namibia is probably one of the most stable democracies in the world at present.
Right. I don't claim any original genius on this. This is just applying the lessons of what's been done hundreds of places elsewhere in history.
What do they say in response to you? I mean, inside, I read the articles and all of that, the criticism, but when you talk to serious people...
I've heard some people saying they're adapting my plan, they're not going public with it because they don't want to give any credit. That's fine. I don't care. But, and then there's others. Look, the military-industrial complex is very real. The amount of money, okay? Someone talked about at lunch about another boondoggle, right? We're giving them 170 Black Hawk helicopters. That's an $8 billion program for Lockheed Martin, okay? You want to talk about occupied territory in Washington? Capitol Hill, occupied by a battalion strength of lobbyists for those big defense contractors. They are very happy to see the annuity of $62 billion a year to continue. I take great umbrage when people say, Erik Prince wants to privatize this and make money. Yeah, I'm going to I would try to make money, but anybody that can go from burning $62 billion to less than 10 total for the whole thing, hey, I think that would be a public good.
What do they say what flaws do they find?
Mattis just said because it doesn't make the Pentagon look good. What else can they say? Who can defend 17 years of what we've been doing? I challenge them. And if somebody has a better idea, please sound off. I'm all ears. But this is not a theoretical exercise for me. I've had thousands of people on the ground doing the mentoring job and all the rest. We backed our way into the mentoring business because we were hired, we Blackwater were hired to build the Afghan border police. Built the bases, trained thousands of folks. We had to change the curriculum at the beginning because we had to do like an intro to toilet use, okay? Because these are literally guys that were illiterate coming from the boonies that had never used a flush toilet before, never lived in a building with electric lights. But once they did all that, they saw for 10 weeks exactly what it's supposed to look like. Three meals a day, instructors that knew what they were teaching, the vehicles had fuel, the batteries were in the radios, we had a comm plan, there was ammo for the guns. Holy cow. This is a vision of what my life could be like if we can continue on. And those guys were so proud of graduating from that class because it's the first thing they ever graduated from, because they probably didn't go past, grade 4 or 5 in school. They fought hard, they paid attention, and we kept asking the Pentagon to let our instructors go with these guys once they graduated to be mentors in the field. And they kept resisting, it's too dangerous, it's this, it's that. No, we finally relented. They finally relented, and we allowed to do it. And the success rate of these guys was phenomenal because they had that training wheel, adult leadership. Because you can't take somebody that's illiterate and in 10 weeks teach them to be the equivalent of a U.S. Customs and Border policeman operating in a war zone with their Dishka mortars and fighting the Taliban. You can't do that in 10 weeks. But you can with some adult leadership that goes with them to do more on-the-job training. And it worked. The amount of bombs, bomb makers we seized, and all the rest. It was amazing. My inbox was full of guys sending me pictures of the people that they were wrapping up. Because it worked. You know, the Defense Human Service, okay, the guys supposed to be providing intelligence, were not allowed to leave the base to meet their assets. Okay, so if you're a spy spying for America, you had to come up to the front of the U.S. base because the U.S. guy was not allowed to leave the base because of force protection requirements. That is a microcosm of why we are failing in Afghanistan. Come on. Let's not worship proceduralism. Let's focus on results. Sir.
This is the last question.
Okay.
Mr. Public Good.
All right.
Great presentation. Thank you so much for that. And I was just going to hang on your question. What Mattis actually said, was that since the U.S. reputation is on the line, it needs to be U.S. forces. But you make a good point. After 17 years, that reputation could probably use an overhaul or some attention. So my question,
and it's still U.S. veterans getting it done.
Well, no. So, and the other part of your proposal, which I think accounts for that, is it's still U.S. forces on the line because you have 2,000 special forces.
That's right.
And it's still under a U.S. commander. So I think you addressed that in the core proposal. What I'd just be curious, because is if you could say a little bit more about the innovations that are going to accelerate that success. So one, of course, is the idea that there's non-rotational, right? These advisors and these mentors will be there for overnight. So that's one. That's a huge thing, right?
Multi-year.
Yeah. So what else is in there that you think will help accelerate that? So that while I know you don't expect another 17 years, what's going to get that time down to even more cost effective?
I would even say effective use of assets, right? As simple things like a side-fire gunship that'll actually fly in the daytime, right? You have a wonderful AC-130. Since 1991, the U.S. Air Force won't fly that in daytime, or they won't even fly it at night if there's more than 70% illumination. Okay, the most effective counterinsurgency fire sport platform in existence today, and it's limited to a few hours a month. Okay, I'm going to put pilots that'll fly that sucker 24/7. How many aircraft have been lost over Afghanistan to enemy missile fire? 0. Okay? There's been 92 aircraft lost to ground fire. PKs, Dishkas, RPGs against helicopters. There is no manpad threat. We do not need supersonic jets hitting tankers and bombing from 25,000 feet, dropping a $55,000 bomb to hit 2 dudes on a pickup truck. Come on. Put the close back in close air support. Altering tactics, adjusting for the realities on the ground instead of adopting the air operations Bible that they've adopted from a Cold War mentality. Those are the kind of changes we make on the periphery that matter a lot. Afghans will fight harder, and they will hang on, and they will not surrender if they know somebody's coming. Our model would use fast jets, again, with an Afghan on board. So it's not a contractor dropping a bomb. It's the Afghan in the aircraft releasing that weapon. An Alert 5 status out of Kandahar or Bagram, I can have a fast jet over anywhere in Afghanistan in less than 30 minutes. They'll hang on for that long.
One last question.
Sir,
Send it.
If the U.S. military were to follow your model, what U.S. forces would transition out of Afghanistan using your smaller model, and how long would it take?
Less than a year, and pretty much all conventional forces would rotate back. The soft guys would stay, and maybe a military medicine unit could, but I think we could actually outsource all of that as well. Look, the Pentagon has we talked about transitioning from counterterrorism, right? The new force posture of the U.S. military, transitioning back to dealing with state-on-state threats. Okay, fine. Let's recapitalize. Let's save $50 billion a year and recapitalize our conventional capabilities so that we don't have a peer competitor anymore, and stop wasting money and wasting young people's lives and limbs. Anybody else? Going. Thank you.
Hey, sir, I think everybody would agree that was a pretty amazing presentation. We got a little gift for you. We know that your time is very valuable. And so we'd like for you to take with this, put it in your office maybe, or whatever. It's the Boar's Head Brigade crest.
All right.
And I think the motto applies to what you're after.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay, it's 5 after 4, so we're gonna reconvene at 4:15, 16:15. You got 10 minutes. All right.
Keith, the thing tonight, I thought it was at 1800.
Sure. It says 1800 on the you know, on the little schedule, the book. Oh, social 6:30.
In the book it says 6?
Yes, I think so. I think so. 6:30.
That's not going to work. All right, we got 1 minute. Okay, let's find our seats. All right. I'm extremely fortunate to introduce Laura Dickinson, and she is the research professor of law at George Washington Law School. Her work focuses on national security, human rights, foreign affairs, privatization, and qualitative empirical approaches to international law. Her book, Outsourcing War and Peace, examines the increasing privatization of military, security, and foreign aid functions of government, considers the impact of this trend on core public values, and outlines mechanisms for protecting these values in an era of privatization. She has a distinguished record of government service. She served as special counsel to the General Counsel of the Department of Defense, Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the U.S. Department of State, and is a former law clerk to U.S. Supreme Court Justices Blackmun and Breyer, and also to Judge Nelson of the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. So please help me welcome Laura Dickinson.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to speak at this conference. As a lawyer and a legal scholar who has been working on these issues for more than a decade, I'm truly honored to be here. And I believe this conference is surely going to make a difference to leaders in confronting issues related to the use of private military and security contractors. I think it's essential that leaders confront these issues. As we can see, PMSCs are here to stay. And I think, as we can see from the presentations, there are going to be some tough decisions on the horizon. So the massive outsourcing of foreign affairs functions is not new, as Mr. Prince noted, but we did see an upsurge in outsourcing at the end of the Cold War. And at the high points of the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, as was noted, we had about 260,000 contractors, a ratio of contractors to troops that hovered around 1 to 1. And this outsourcing posed a threat to what I have called public law values, the values embedded in international humanitarian law, also known as the law of armed conflict and international human rights law. And one of the big issues was that it was unclear how these bodies of law, which were designed to address the use of force by governmental actors, how they would apply to contractors in conflict zones. And so the stage was set for abuses and problems. Let's see. One of the most notorious incidents, of course, was the Nisour Square incident. Also, the use of contractors in interrogation at Abu Ghraib prison. And part of the issue was that at this point, contractors were not subject to the same kind of training, oversight, and accountability as troops, even as the U.S. military got blamed for what contractors did. We also saw the Commission on Wartime Contracting report note that there was upwards of $30 billion, between $31 billion and $60 billion of waste, fraud, and abuse during this period. Now, in the last 5 years, we've seen a big improvement in the oversight and accountability of contractors. In particular, some categories of contractors, including the ones that have been the most controversial, private security contractors. So what do our experiences with private security contractors tell us about potentially new uses of contractors in conflict zones? That is going to be the focus of my remarks. And the short answer is that I think we should be wary of proposals to throw contractors at a problem, particularly when they are doing new things in new ways. Using contractors can bring significant legal and policy risks that might be hard to see at the outset. And so I think we should take a look at the past and try not to repeat our mistakes. And I should note that these issues face many countries around the world, whether a country is hiring contractors, whether a country is hosting them on its soil, whether a country is sending its nationals to become contractors. But because the focus of my research has been on the United States, that's what I'm going to focus on in my talk today. So, also because I'm a lawyer and a legal scholar, I'm going to start by talking about legal issues. And these are very important issues because law goes to the heart of legitimacy. So, first, when we turn to contractors in this post-Cold War period, one of the big legal issues we saw were legal framework issues. It was unclear the precise legal framework that governed contractors and how it governed contractors. We've made a lot of progress. So the Swiss government, the ICRC, in partnership with many governments and the industry, the United States played a key role in this, developed the Montreux document on pertinent legal obligations and good practices for states related to the operation of PMSCs. This was tremendously significant, and it is an ongoing process and a forum where states can meet to discuss these issues. The document makes it clear that contractors, such as private security contractors, must follow the law of armed conflict and human rights law were applicable. And this was very important. And in addition, there was an offshoot from this, which was the development of a code of conduct for private security contractors specifically. And this was quite significant because the industry came together with civil society, including human rights groups and governments, to work out very concrete standards that should apply to private security contractors in conflict zones. We also saw the development of business management standards that translated these principles regarding the use of force into clear standards that companies could understand and apply in practical terms. And so, for example, we have the American National Standards Institute standard PSC1, which has been very significant and is terrific substantively, and also a comparable international standard as well. States have made an impact by applying these standards to their private security contractors. But I should note that it took us a long time to get here. What about other types of contractors? Well, the Montreux document addresses some of these other types of contractors, including advisors to local forces, but the standards are much less well developed, and it's not even really clear whether Montreux applies to advisors of partner forces. So with respect to these other kinds of contractors, we are nowhere near where we are now with PSCs. There's also no spin-off code of conduct for these contractors, right? That has been an important development. We don't have that. So we're way behind even in defining the clear rules and best practices that might apply to these kinds of contractors. But we do know from Montreux that states are on the hook legally for their use of contractors. And now if contractors were embedded with local or partner forces, that could present some pretty tricky legal issues and some problems for states, both under the law of armed conflict itself, but also under the law of state responsibility, under which states can be responsible in certain circumstances when they advise and assist. And this is significant because it affects a state's legitimacy if a state is bearing legal responsibility for the action of contractors when things go wrong. There could also potentially, if things went really wrong, and I'm not saying they would, but if they did, there could potentially be problems for a state and state actors under international criminal law, under the doctrine of aiding and abetting. And I don't think we can dismiss this because there have been developments in this body of law recently that pose a significant issue here. Another significant problem is the fact that PMSCs can act in ways that could constitute taking a direct part in hostilities under the law of armed conflict. Now, the United States has managed this with respect to PSCs by drawing a line between offensive and defensive actions. We've drawn a line. We've said we're not going to let PSCs do offensive action. That line is actually not recognized in LOAC, but as a practical matter, that has reduced the instances in which there is a risk of this. If we're using new categories of contractors in ways, for example, if we're embedding them with local forces, I think there are real risks in this area that could pose significant legal problems for states such as the United States. Okay, so far we've looked just at the legal framework. What about implementation? What about oversight on the front end and accountability on the back end? Because this is how law gets meaning in application. So what we've seen with PSCs is that even with the significant efforts and the significant accomplishments that we've made over the years, there still is a significant way to go. So let me start with contract. I've been a big proponent of using the tool of the government contract to bring public values into our use of private military and security contractors. And there have been great strides made in this area. The contracts are now written with more specificity and with the issues related to public values translated into the terms of the contracts themselves. The other thing that's happened is, of course, the development of those business management standards that I mentioned, PSC 1 and the ISO standard, because now states, including the United States, are requiring security contractors to be certified under those standards, which again have quite good substantive rules regarding the use of force and so on, translated into business terms. That being said, well, we don't have anything comparable for other categories of contractors, right? And even with PSC 1 and the ISO standard, the systems for management of contractors, while they've improved, as we've seen based on some of the earlier comments today, they still have a way to go. And why is that? Well, it still remains hard to incentivize contract management personnel to go to conflict zones and to get enough of them to do that. So that's a big one. And the other problem is that accountability on the back end for contractual problems and violations has proven to be very difficult. Only limited categories of entities can actually enforce contractual violations, and the debarment process has been notoriously ineffective. So now let's turn to criminal accountability. As was noted, the U.S. Congress expanded the reach of the Uniform Code of Military Justice to cover contractors. This is significant, but it has been rarely used. And there are some pretty big potential constitutional problems with using military justice for contractors. Not necessarily insurmountable, but they're big lurking problems out there. What about civilian criminal accountability? Well, Congress has had on its plate for more than a decade the Civilian Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act, which would close important loopholes in providing U.S. courts with civilian criminal jurisdiction in the case of extreme violations, when things go bad with contractors. You know, they still haven't passed it. They have a lot of other problems. So, but that would be a really important development. Now we still have MIJA, the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act. There are big loopholes in MIJA. It covers DoD contractors and any other contractors who are supporting a DoD mission. But that leaves a lot of gaps with respect to, say, for example, State Department contractors and others. And even apart from these jurisdictional gaps, as a practical matter, implementing criminal accountability for things that happen in war zones is very, very difficult, as we've seen with the repeated failed prosecutions in the Nisour Square incident case. So all this shows that the criminal accountability framework remains riddled with problems 17 years after the beginning of the conflict in Afghanistan. Now, there are some other areas of accountability where if you're a human rights organization and you want to see accountability, there are openings. So, but if you're the government and if you're a contractor, there are areas of concern. So one is tort liability. Contractors are not subject to the Ferez Doctrine, which is a doctrine that says that U.S. troops can't sue the government. So there's room for contractors to sue the government if things go wrong. Also, third parties might try to sue contractors. And there are pretty broad defenses that have come into play, such as the political question doctrine or battlefield preemption, which would limit the ability of courts to address these issues. But the courts are kind of all over the map on this. And from the U.S. government's perspective, the prospect of litigation could expose the government to political decision-making and ill repute. And this has happened, arguably, in some cases. And there are a number of cases that have settled. For example, a case involving the two intelligence contractors who reportedly were involved in the development of the waterboarding techniques that were used in the early days of the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, Mitchell and Jessen. That suit recently settled. There was also litigation against other security firms that settled. And I would just say that if more contractors were operating in different roles, these kinds of issues under tort would likely be exacerbated. Certainly we'd see more litigation. And that litigation has costs for the government. There's the cost of defending that or deciding whether to get involved in the lawsuit and the cost of doing that. But also some of the costs that contractors pay in litigation would get passed on to the U.S. government in some contexts. We also have issues with respect to host nation accountability processes. So, for example, security and defense cooperation agreements, while they immunize U.S. troops from prosecution in host nations, some of them, for example, the Afghanistan agreement, would not immunize contractors, does not immunize contractors. And litigation in Afghan courts against contractors could pose problems for the United States, both in terms of the actual litigation costs, but also reputational costs and costs potentially to the U.S. mission. And there's another issue that's quite significant in Afghanistan. There is a long pending decision by the International Criminal Court on whether to go to the next level in terms of authorizing an investigation in Afghanistan. This would include investigation into alleged violations of the law of armed conflict in 2003 by U.S. forces and other personnel. Now, private military personnel are often viewed, rightly or wrongly, as more likely to commit abuses than uniformed soldiers, and I'm not saying that they are, but I do think we have to consider what the risk might be if we put contractors in new roles in Afghanistan, that this could tip the scales for the ICC prosecutor's decision the court's decision to move forward with an investigation in Afghanistan, which would then put, our troops at risk. Now, you could say, well, there are other ways of dealing with the ICC. Some people have argued we should, go after the ICC, but on the other hand, that might not serve our strategic goals as well, and there are certainly long-term costs to the United States and our relationship with our allies if we do that. Okay, so turning from law to policy, I think we would do well to consider the lessons learned from our use of PSCs in Iraq and Afghanistan on the policy front. And one of the things we discovered, and this has been raised by other speakers, is that supervising contractors, particularly ones in conflict zones who are authorized to use force or who are implicated in the use of force, turns out to be pretty difficult. That's partly because of the legal framework and accountability issues discussed above, including things like training and vetting. But it also has to do with the organizational structure and the fact that contractors, as we've noted, are outside the chain of command. And certainly in the early phases of the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, we had massive coordination problems. Now, we've sorted some of that out with respect to PSCs, particularly now that we have a smaller number of PSCs. But it really did take a long time to do that. And I think adding new types of contractors to the mix and fundamentally changing the proportion of contractors to troops and those overseeing them could present real challenges on this front. The other thing I should note is that contractors don't typically have the equivalent of military lawyers working with them, embedded with them, helping to vet decisions about the use of force. And again, I come back to the fact that law is key to the legitimacy of our military operations. And we have some of the most phenomenal military lawyers in the world working for the United States. And so one should be very careful about thinking about using contractors in a way that could implicate the use of force without having the benefit of that legal advice. Let's see here. I'd like to turn now to legitimacy. Again, I've been saying law is linked to legitimacy. And I want to emphasize that when things go wrong, when contractors are acting, particularly when they're using force and things go wrong, the U.S. military inevitably gets blamed. And that affects the legitimacy of the U.S. military's mission, and it can affect the legitimacy of larger U.S. foreign policy objectives. Now, we've fixed this problem to some degree for PSCs, so that is a source of optimism. But I think the length of time in which it's taken us to fix that problem should lead us to be wary of putting contractors into situations where they could be implicated in the use of force and undermine that legitimacy. I want to turn now to the concept of inherently governmental functions. And I put this under policy because the international law on this is actually pretty murky. There have been efforts to define mercenaries that are riddled with loopholes and difficult to apply. And so I would not say that that's been clearly addressed as a matter of international law. And domestically, we've dealt with it through policy, through our policy in the United States on what is inherently governmental and what is not. U.S. policy draws a distinction between offensive combat and defensive uses of force. And we've made a decision that offensive combat should not be outsourced. And that's reflected in various policy directives, also in the 2011 Office of Federal Procurement Policy letter, which was really a significant development here. And there are a variety of reasons why we've drawn that distinction. We've also retreated from some functions being outsourced. For example, we've largely retreated from the use of interrogation contractors, and that was a reaction to the abuses from Abu Ghraib and elsewhere. It's hard to maintain that line between offensive and defensive use of force, and we've seen that with PSCs, but it's a relatively workable line. I think if we are going to put contractors into new roles, I think we have to be really careful about whether we might cross that line. There's also another way of thinking about this that's reflected in that 2011 letter, and that has to do with core functions and proportions. And the idea is that you don't ban certain functions per se, but you want to look really carefully if you change the proportion of contractors to military and civilian personnel, such that there's a vastly reduced military and civilian personnel and a higher number of contractors in that proportion. You want to be really careful about what you're doing there, and that is a problem with respect to inherently governmental functions. Last but not least, I'd like to talk about costs. And I think our experience with PSCs has shown us that we should be wary of arguments that it will be cheaper to use them. And of course, one of the challenges here is that the political costs of sending contractors to conflict zones are much, much lower than sending uniformed troops, and others have mentioned this elsewhere. And that's why I've argued in my book and elsewhere that U.S. presidents from Bill Clinton, George Bush, Barack Obama, and now potentially President Trump have found the use of contractors attractive. And I've argued actually that the use of contractors helps the executive branch expand executive power vis-a-vis Congress by arguing that legally our use of force is below the war threshold that requires congressional authorization under the Constitution and the War Powers Resolution. Of course, in addition to these lower political costs, there's also the point that a lot of advocates of the use of more contractors make, which is that they'll be cheaper, more effective. But I think we have to be really careful about how we think about what the true costs of using contractors really are. And as I mentioned earlier, the Commission for Wartime Contracting concluded in 2011 that the earlier widespread use of contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan cost American taxpayers $31 to $61 billion in waste, fraud, and abuse. That wasn't a projected ex-ante cost, but that was something that emerged after the fact. And And that, of course, doesn't include a lot of other financial costs, such as litigation costs that I mentioned earlier, nor does it include potential costs to legitimacy of U.S. missions, particularly if contractors are using new roles without a clear legal framework and accountability mechanisms that work. So, to conclude, I think that the lessons of the past 15 years tell us that we have to be very careful before adding contractors to conflict zones, particularly when they're performing new functions where they might be implicated in the use of force. And our experience with PSCs tells us that we can improve oversight and accountability for contractors that use force. We can improve that legal framework, but it takes a very long time to get it right. And even then, there are risks that remain. So I think we ought to proceed with caution, if at all. Thank you.
I feel it necessary, since you brought up Nisir Square twice, despite the apparent foregone conclusion that the men were guilty there, they've been tried now 3 times, subjected to the full weight of the federal government. The first time the case was thrown out for prosecutorial misconduct. The second time it was thrown out on appeal. And the third time was a mistrial. Hardly a jury of their peers in Washington, D.C., trying a wartime action and second-guessing a split-second decision in a war zone. So I just throw that up there. MEJA versus the UCMJ, I would always go with the UCMJ and have the investigation and prosecution done as close to the edge of battle as possible. Now, question for you.
Can I just say, though, there's also the problem of the Constitution with respect to UCMJ trying civilians. And I think
when you sign up for the military, you sign away your rights, and
yes,
you subject yourself to the UCMJ, let a contractor do the same thing.
Well, under
anybody that's willing to go there and do that, trust me, the people that have been subjected to the nonsense of the federal court system back here trying cases would much rather be tried by a jury of their military peers in a war zone. Now, I think it's wonderful for you to look at all these issues. But for you, I would just ask the question, what do you tell that Afghan mother if you are going to deny the ability to put mentor forces with her son, or deny the medevac that they need to keep them alive, since they're dying at a rate of 7 times what a U.S. soldier is? Okay? What are you going to tell that Afghan mother, sorry, we can't get there because of the law of armed conflict and in a letter that some Swiss guys made? And are you ready to send your son or daughter for another 17 years of the same thing we've been doing in Afghanistan?
So first of all, about the Constitution, there's a case called Reed v. Covert, where the United States Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional to try a civilian in a military court. And so I think there are really serious constitutional questions about whether you could try contractors in military courts. That's not to say that it's... You could say that, but again, how do you get around Reed v. Covert? Maybe you can, but it's a really important point that can't be overlooked. Second, with respect to the Afghan mother, what happens if there's a targeting decision that goes bad and there are U.S. contractors embedded with Afghan forces killing that mother's children? What happens to the legitimacy of the U.S. mission in Afghanistan, to our relationships with our allies, and to our foreign policy objectives? That's my question for you.
Everything I've talked about doing is putting it in empowering the Afghans to do it. Not a contractor making that decision. The Afghan battalion commander or the Afghan aircraft making that decision. Because right now we don't have a lot of credibility in the Afghans anymore. They're being slaughtered like sheep.
Okay, well, if you put a U.S. funded contractor in there with the Afghans, the United States government very likely will bear legal responsibility if things go awry. And not only will they bear legal responsibility, they will bear moral responsibility and responsibility in terms of legitimacy. So I'm just
Let it be an Afghan contract. Are you ready to send your son or daughter to do the same thing for 17 years?
I'd be ready to send my son to serve in our military, and I also think, excuse me?
To Afghanistan, to do the same thing we've been doing for 17 years.
Yes, I would. I would. And
I'm going to interject and speak on behalf of your son. Let your son decide. It's inappropriate for any of us to talk about, I would send my child. They have the right to decide for themselves. And the sidebar here is good, but with respect, if you can let some other folks ask some questions, that'd be great.
Got a question over here.
I had a question.
Yeah,
okay,
please.
So you talked a lot about risk. So the U.S. military faces a lot of issues in itself with just who they hire and who goes on deployments and such. Like, there were a lot of issues, especially in the early 2000s, with actual gang members joining the military from like the Latin Kings, and they were joining the infantry to get training specifically so they could come back and use it in the gangs. So there's also the notable issues of rape within the military and such. So my question is, how much higher do you think the risks of having professional contractors who have been in the area, have more experience, and are there for that specific job, do you really think the risk is higher to have humanitarian crisis with them or with American soldiers who don't have as much experience?
yes, I think the risks are greater. That's the short answer. The reason is we have a very well-developed system. It doesn't always work perfectly, of accountability, oversight, good order, and discipline with our military. And it doesn't always work perfectly. But we do have that military justice system. We do have those military lawyers. Again, I'm not saying there isn't a problem with respect to sexual assault and accountability, but we do have that system in place, and that is part of what gives our military operations legitimacy. So.
Hey, you talked a lot about legitimacy, but if you could unpack exactly what it means that the United States would lose legitimacy, so what does it mean if I'm not a lawyer, or if, I mean, it's because it seems that it goes above us.
Okay, well, there are different ways of defining legitimacy. Two ways might be kind of compliance with rules that the international community has long accepted, like rules regarding targeting. You don't target civilians. You don't do disproportionate targeting that has disproportionate harm to civilians, things like that, which have been long accepted in international law. And so if you change the way that you are using force and using different actors who might not have the same training or the same knowledge of or respect for those rules, then you undermine that system. But it also has to do with public perceptions. That would be a different definition of legitimacy. It would have to do with public perceptions of, for example, the public in a host nation where your military is operating, perceptions in countries of allies who are partnering with you in your military operations. And again, when actions violate the law or appear to violate the law, it can affect legitimacy in that sense as well.
I was kind of stunned when you said that we have the best military lawyers that are working with military commanders for the engagement of lethal force. At what level do you think that might be too much? I've been out for quite a while. I'm Vietnam era, but we didn't have lawyers, you know, at the company level, battalion level. I don't even know if the division level. I mean, I don't know if that's a good thing, because you got to make split decisions. At what level do you think legal advice should be brought in?
Look, it's a fair point, and true, there's a greater role for JAGs post-Vietnam. Part of that was a response to some of the issues that took place in Vietnam. Some people argue we've gone too far with that. One of the issues that happened, I would say, at the end of the Obama administration was not so much the law, but the development of very restrictive policies that went over and above the requirements of the law and imposed even higher standards and required decision-making at a really high level. And reports are that some of those restrictions have been lowered. And so I think that some of the issues you're talking about are not so much a matter of law as of policy. And at the end of the day, you need to have military lawyers. They play a really important role in training and providing advice. It's actually required by the law of war, right? Those treaties that the United States has signed actually require the use of military lawyers and the provision of military legal advice. Obviously, the commanders are the ones that make that decision. So you can change, the decision-making hierarchy, the point in the decision-making hierarchy where the lawyers are operating, or how high up the chain it has to go, and what the rules are for, dynamic targeting as opposed to deliberate targeting. But I think the role of lawyers is essential.
Thank you. No pressure at all. Just a question, a bit more broader. To what extent has this phenomenon of legalizing or legitimizing the use of security contractors gone global in a wider sense? Have you picked that up?
Well, my focus is mostly on the United States, so my base of knowledge is mostly the United States. But I will say that for PSCs, it has gone global to some degree. So that Montreux document, was the initiative of many, many states. And the industry was very involved in that, and the offshoot, the International Code of Conduct. I think that's terrific. I mean, we talk about legitimacy. The industry has a stake in this. The industry has a stake in accountable use of contractors. And many in the industry recognize it. That's why they got behind the Code of Conduct. That's why they got behind PSC1. That's why they got behind ISO, because that is part of what gives the industry legitimacy.
Okay.
Thank you.
Tough questions, but good questions. And that's really why we're here today, just to kind of sort through some of this stuff as we can. We have a little gift for you as well, and has your name on it.
Oh, wow.
And you can put this in your law office or your office at the university. If I can get it
If I can open it.
How many instruments does it take to open a box? Okay.
Oh, that's fantastic.
But if you'll take that as a token of our appreciation.
Thank you very much.
One of our speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, don't move. Okay, so our next event, as I mentioned this morning, is the social at the Smith House downtown. If you don't know where the Smith House is, there's a diagram or a map in the back of your program. And it's going to be heavy hors d'oeuvres and an open bar there. The dress will be very casual, so jeans are just fine. You're welcome. It's only a 10-minute walk from here, but it's right on a square downtown there. Remember that the planning group here is going to have a little hot wash with the War College at Tony for just a couple of minutes following this. Tomorrow morning we're going to begin at 8:45 sharp. I noticed a lot of empty parking spaces out in the front of the convocation center that had cones in front of them. That was for you. I forgot to tell you that just stop, remove the cone, and park into space. So tomorrow morning, go ahead and park where the cones are. Just don't run them over. Put them in the front of the space. Okay. So we'll see you at 6:30 at the Smith House. Other than that, we'll see you at 8:45 tomorrow morning. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.